This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Zale Schaefer. A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Book the Second, The Golden Thread. Chapter 1, 5 years later. Tellson's Bank by Temple Bar was an old-fashioned place, even in the year 1780. It was very small, very dark, very ugly, very incommodious. It was an old-fashioned place, moreover, in the moral attribute that the partners in the house were proud of its smallness, proud of its darkness, proud of its ugliness, proud of its incommodiousness. They were even boastful of its eminence in those particulars, and were fired by an express conviction that if it were less objectionable, it would be less respectable. This was no passive belief, but an active weapon which they flashed at more convenient places of business. Tellson's, they said, wanted no elbow-room. Tellson's wanted no light. Tellson's wanted no embellishment. Noakes and Company's might, or Snooks Brothers might, but Tellson's, thank heaven. Any one of these partners would have disinherited his son on the question of rebuilding Tellson's. In this respect the house was much on a par with the country, which did very often disinherit its sons for suggesting improvements in laws and customs that had long been highly objectionable, but were only the more respectable. Thus it had come to pass that Tellson's was the triumphant perfection of inconvenience. After bursting open a door of idiotic obstinacy, with a weak rattle in its throat, you fell into Tellson's down 2 steps and came to your senses in a miserable little shop, with 2 little counters, where the oldest of men made your cheque shake as if the wind rustled it, while they examined the signature by the dingiest of windows, which were always under a shower-bath of mud from Fleet Street, and which were made the dingier by their own iron bars proper, and the heavy shadow of Temple Bar. If your business necessitated your seeing the house, you were put into a species of condemned hold at the back, where you meditated on a misspent life until the house came with its hands in its pockets, and you could hardly blink at it in the dismal twilight. Your money came out of, or went into, wormy old wooden drawers, particles of which flew up your nose and down your throat when they were opened and shut. Your bank-notes had a musty odor, as if they were fast decomposing into rags again. Your plate was stowed away among the neighboring cesspools, and evil communications corrupted its good polish in a day or 2. Your deeds got into extemporized strong-rooms made of kitchens and sculleries, and fretted all the fat out of their parchments into the banking-house air. Your lighter boxes of family papers went upstairs into a Barmecide room that always had a great dining-table in it and never had a dinner, and where, even in the year 1780, the first letters written to you by your old love, or by your little children, were but newly released from the horror of being ogled through the windows by the heads exposed on Temple Bar with an insensate brutality and ferocity worthy of Abyssinia or Ashanti. But indeed, at that time, putting to death was a recipe much in vogue with all trades and professions, and not least of all with Tellson's. Death is nature's remedy for all things, and why not legislation's? Accordingly, the forger was put to death. The utterer of a bad note was put to death. The unlawful opener of a letter was put to death. The purloiner of 40 shillings and 6pence was put to death. The holder of a horse at Tellson's door, who made off with it, was put to death. The coiner of a bad shilling was put to death. The sounders of 3/4 of the notes in the whole gamut of crime were put to death. Not that it did the least good in the way of prevention. It might almost have been worth remarking that the fact was exactly the reverse, but it cleared off, as to this world, the trouble of each particular case, and left nothing else connected with it to be looked after. Thus Tellson's, in its day, like greater places of business, its contemporaries, had taken so many lives that if the heads laid low before it had been ranged on Temple Bar instead of being privately disposed of, they would have probably excluded what little light the ground floor had in a rather significant manner. Cramped in all kinds of dim cupboards and hutches at Tellson's, the oldest of men carried on the business gravely. When they took a young man into Tellson's London house, they hid him somewhere until he was old. They kept him in a dark place like a cheese until he had the full Tellson flavour and blue mould upon him. Then only was he permitted to be seen, spectacularly poring over large books and casting his breeches and gaiters into the general weight of the establishment. Outside Tellson's, never by any means in it, unless called in, was an odd job man, an occasional porter and messenger, who served as the life sign of the house. He was never absent during business hours unless upon an errand, and then he was represented by his son, a grisly urchin of 12 who was his express image. People understood that Tellson's in a stately way tolerated the odd job man. The house had always tolerated some person in that capacity, and time and tide had drifted this person to the post. His surname was Cruncher, and on the youthful occasion of his renouncing by proxy the works of darkness in the easterly parish church of Houndsditch, he had received an added appellation of Jerry. The scene was Mr. Cruncher's private lodging in Hanging Sword Alley, Whitefriars. The time 7:30 of the clock on a windy March morning, Anno Domini 1780. Mr. Cruncher himself always spoke of the year of our Lord as Anno Dominos, apparently under the impression that the Christian era dated from the invention of a popular game by a lady who had bestowed her name upon it. Mr. Cruncher's apartments were not in a savoury neighbourhood, and were but 2 in number, even if a closet with a single pane of glass in it might be counted as one. But they were very decently kept. Early as it was on the windy March morning, the room in which he lay abed was already scrubbed throughout, and between the cups and saucers arranged for breakfast, and the lumbering deal table, a very clean white cloth was spread. Mr. Cruncher reposed under a patchwork counterpane like a harlequin at home. At first he slept heavily, but by degrees began to roll and surge in bed until he rose above the surface, with his spiky hair looking as if it must tear the sheets to ribbons, at which juncture he exclaimed in a voice of dire exasperation, "Bust me if she ain't at it again!" A woman of orderly and industrious appearance rose from her knees in a corner, with sufficient haste and trepidation to show that she was the person referred to. "What!" said Mr. Cruncher, looking out of bed for a boot. "You're at it again, are you?" After hailing the morn with this second salutation, he threw a boot at the woman as a third. It was a very muddy boot, and may introduce the odd circumstance connected with Mr. Cruncher's domestic economy, that whereas he often came home after banking hours with clean boots, he often got up next morning to find the same boots covered with clay. "What!" said Mr. Cruncher, varying his apostrophe after missing his mark. "What are you up to, aggrawator?" "I was only saying my prayers." "Saying your prayers? You're a nice woman. What do you mean by flopping yourself down and praying agin me?" "I was not praying against you. I was praying for you." "You weren't, and if you were, I won't be took the liberty with. Here, your mother's a nice woman, young Jerry, going a praying agin your father's prosperity. You've got a dutiful mother, you have, my son. You've got a religious mother, you have, my boy, going and flopping herself down and praying that the bread and butter may be snatched out of the mouth of her only child." Master Cruncher, who was in his shirt, took this very ill, and turning to his mother, strongly deprecated any praying away of his personal board. "And what do you suppose, you conceited female," said Mr. Cruncher, with unconscious inconsistency, "that the worth of your prayers may be? Name the price that you put your prayers at." "They only come from the heart, Jerry. They are worth no more than that." "Worth no more than that," repeated Mr. Cruncher. "They ain't worth much, then. Whether or no, I won't be prayed agin, I tell you. I can't afford it. I'm not a-going to be made unlucky by your sneaking. If you must go flopping yourself down, flop in favour of your husband and child, and not in opposition to 'em. If I had had any but an unnatural wife, and this poor boy had had any but an unnatural mother, I might have made some money last week, instead of being counter-prayed and countermined and religiously circumvented into the worst of luck." "Bust me," said Mr. Cruncher, who all this time had been putting on his clothes, "if I ain't, what with piety and one blowed thing and another, been choosed this last week into as bad luck as ever a poor devil of a honest tradesman met with.
Young Jerry, dress yourself, my boy, and while I clean my boots, keep an eye on your mother now and then, and if you see any signs of more flopping, give me a call. For I tell you," here he addressed his wife once more, "I won't be gone again in this manner. I am as rickety as a hackney coach. I'm as sleepy as laudanum. My lines is strained to that degree that I shouldn't know if it wasn't for the pain in 'em, which was me and which somebody else, yet I'm none the better for it in pocket, and it's my suspicion that you've been at it from morning to night to prevent me from being the better for it in pocket, and I won't put up with it, aggrawator, and what do you say now?" Growling, in addition, such phrases as, "Ah, yes, you're religious, too. You wouldn't put yourself in opposition to the interests of your husband and child, would you? Not you," and throwing off other sarcastic sparks from the whirling grindstone of his indignation, Mr. Cruncher betook himself to his boot cleaning and his general preparation for business. In the meantime, his son, whose head was garnished with tender spikes, and whose young eyes stood close by one another, as his father's did, kept the required watch upon his mother. He greatly disturbed that poor woman at intervals by darting out of his sleeping closet, where he made his toilet, with a suppressed cry of, "You are going to flop, mother! Hello, father!" and after raising this fictitious alarm, darting in again with an undutiful grin. Mr. Cruncher's temper was not at all improved when he came to his breakfast. He resented Mrs. Cruncher saying grace with particular animosity. "Now, aggrawator, what are you up to? At it again?" His wife explained that she had merely asked a blessing. "Don't do it," said Mr. Cruncher, looking about as if he rather expected to see the loaf disappear under the efficacy of his wife's petitions. "I ain't a-going to be blessed out of house and home. I won't have my wittles blessed off my table. Keep still." Exceedingly red-eyed and grim, as if he had been up all night at a party which had taken anything but a convivial turn, Jerry Cruncher worried his breakfast rather than ate it, growling over it like any four-footed inmate of a menagerie. Towards 9 o'clock he smoothed his ruffled aspect, and presenting as respectable and business-like an exterior as he could overlay his natural self with, issued forth to the occupation of the day. It could scarcely be called a trade, in spite of his favourite description of himself as "an honest tradesman." His stock consisted of a wooden stool made out of a broken-backed chair cut down, which stool young Jerry, walking at his father's side, carried every morning to beneath the banking-house window that was nearest Temple Bar, where, with the addition of the first handful of straw that could be gleaned from any passing vehicle to keep the cold and wet from the odd-job man's feet, it formed the encampment for the day. On this post of his, Mr. Cruncher was as well known to Fleet Street and the Temple as the bar itself, and was almost as ill-looking. Encamped at 9:15, in good time to touch his three-cornered hat to the oldest of men as they passed into Tellson's, Jerry took up his station on this windy March morning, with young Jerry standing by him, when not engaged in making forays through the bar to inflict bodily and mental injuries of an acute description on passing boys who were small enough for his amiable purpose. Father and son, extremely like each other, looking silently on at the morning traffic in Fleet Street, with their two heads as near to one another as the two eyes of each were, bore a considerable resemblance to a pair of monkeys. The resemblance was not lessened by the accidental circumstance that the mature Jerry bit and spat out straw, while the twinkling eyes of the youthful Jerry were as restlessly watchful of him as of everything else in Fleet Street. The head of one of the regular indoor messengers attached to Tellson's establishment was put through the door, and the word was given. "Porter wanted." "Hooray, father, here's an early job to begin with." Having thus given his parent Godspeed, young Jerry seated himself on the stool, entered on his reversionary interest in the straw his father had been chewing, and cogitated. "Always rusty. His fingers is always rusty," muttered young Jerry. "Where does my father get all that iron rust from? He don't get no iron rust here." End of chapter 1.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Chip in Tampa, Florida, on January 12th, 2006. A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Chapter 2. A Sight. "You know the Old Bailey well, no doubt," said one of the oldest clerks to Jerry the messenger. "Yes, sir," returned Jerry, in something of a dogged manner. "I do know the Bailey." "Just so. And you know Mr. Lorry?" "I know Mr. Lorry, sir, much better than I know the Bailey, much better," said Jerry, not unlike a reluctant witness at the establishment in question. "Then I, as an honest tradesman, wish to know the Bailey." "Very well. Find the door where the witnesses go in, and show the doorkeeper this note for Mr. Lorry. He will then let you in."
"Into the court, sir?"
"Into the court." Mr. Cruncher's eyes seemed to get a little closer to one another, and to interchange the inquiry, "What do you think of this?"
"Am I to wait in the court, sir?"
he asked, as a result of that conference. "I am going to tell you. The doorkeeper will pass the note to Mr. Lorry, and do you make any gesture that will attract Mr. Lorry's attention, and show him where you stand. Then what you have to do is to remain there until he wants you."
"Is that all, sir?"
"That is all. He wishes to have a messenger on hand. This is to tell him you are there." As the ancient clerk deliberately folded and superscribed the note, Mr. Cruncher, after surveying him in silence until he came to the blotting-paper stage, remarked, "I suppose they'll be trying forgeries this morning?" "Treason."
"That's quartering,"
said Jerry.
"Barbarous."
"It is the law," remarked the ancient clerk, turning his surprised spectacles upon him. "It is the law."
"It's hard in the law to spoil a man like that, I think. If it's hard enough to kill him, I know it very hard to spoil him, sir."
"Not at all," retained the ancient clerk. "Speak well of the law. Take care of your chest and voice, my good friend, and leave the law to take care of itself. I give you that advice."
"It's the damp, sir, what settles on my chest and voice," says Jerry. "I'll leave you to judge what a damp way of earning a living mine is, sir."
"Well, well," said the old clerk, "we all have our various ways of gaining a livelihood. Some have damp ways, and some have dry ways. Here is the letter. Go along." Jerry took the letter, and remarking to himself, with less internal deference than he made an outward show of,
"You are a lean old one, too,"
made the bow, informed his son in passing of his destination, and went his way. They hanged at Tyburn in those days, so the street outside Newgate had not obtained one infamous notoriety that has since attached to it, but the jail was a vile place, in which most kinds of debauchery and villainy were practised, and where dire diseases were bred, that came into court with the prisoners, and sometimes rushed straight from the dock at Lord Chief Justice himself, and pulled him off the bench. It had more than once happened that the judge in the black cap pronounced his own doom as certainly as the prisoner's, and even died before him. For the rest, the Old Bailey was famous as a kind of deadly inn-yard, from which pale travellers set out continually, in carts and coaches, on a violent passage into the other world, traversing some 2 miles and a half of public street and road, and shaming few good citizens, if any. So powerful is use, and so desirable to be good use in the beginning. It was famous, too, for the pillory, a wise old institution, that inflicted a punishment of which no one could foresee the extent. Also for the whipping post, another dear old institution, very humanizing and softening to behold in action. Also for extensive transactions in blood money, another fragment of ancestral wisdom, systematically leading to the most frightful mercenary crimes that could be committed under heaven. Another, the Old Bailey, at that date, was a choice illustration of the precept, "Whatever is, is right, an aphorism that would be as final as it was lazy, did not include the troublesome consequence that nothing that ever was wrong. Making his way through the tainted crowd dispersed up and down this hideous sense of action with the skill of a man accustomed to making his way quietly, the messenger found out the door that he sought and handed in his letter through a trap in it. For people then paid to see the play at the Old Bailey, just as they paid to see the play in Bedlam, only the former entertainment was much the dearer. Therefore all the Old Bailey doors were well guarded, except, indeed, the social doors by which the criminals got there, and those were always left wide open. After some delay and demur, the door grudgingly turned on its hinges a very little way, and allowed Mr. Jerry Cruncher to squeeze himself into court. "What's on?" he asked in a whisper of the man he found himself next to. "Nothing yet." "What's coming on?" "The treason case." "The quartering one, eh?" "Ah!" returned the man with relish. "He'll be drawn on a hurdle to be half-hanged. Then he'll be taken down and sliced before his own face. Then his inside'll be taken out and burnt while he looks on. Then his head'll be chopped off, and he'll be cut into quarters. That's the sentence." "If he's found guilty, you mean to say," Jerry added by way of proviso. "Oh, they'll find him guilty," said the other. "Don't you be afraid of that." Mr. Cruncher's attention was here diverted to the doorkeeper, whom he saw making his way to Mr. Lorry with the note in his hand. Mr. Lorry sat at a table among the gentlemen in wigs. Not far from a wigged gentleman, the prisoner's counsel, who had a great bundle of papers before him, was nearly opposite another wigged gentleman with his hands in his pockets, whose whole attention, when Mr. Cruncher looked at him, then or afterwards, seemed to be concentrated on the ceiling of the court. After some gruff coughing and rubbing of his chin and signing with his hand, Jerry attracted the notice of Mr. Lorry, who had stood up to look for him, and who quietly nodded and sat down again. "What's he got to do with the case?" asked the man he had spoken with. "Blest if I know," said Jerry. "And what have you got to do with it, then, if a person may inquire?" "Blest if I know that either," said Jerry. The entrance of the judge and consequent great stir and settling down in the court stopped the dialogue. Presently the dock became the central point of interest. Two jailers who had been standing there went out, and the prisoner was brought in and put to the bar. Everybody present, except the one wigged gentleman who looked at the ceiling, stared at him. All the human breath in the place rolled at him like a sea or a wind or a fire. Eager faces strained round the pillars and corners to get a sight of him. Spectators in back rows stood up, not to miss a hair of him. People on the floor of the court laid their hands on the shoulders of the people before them to help themselves at anybody's cost to view of him, stood a tiptoe, got upon ledges, stood upon next to nothing to see every inch of him. Conspicuous among these latter, like an animated bit of the spiked wall of Newgate, Jerry stood, aiming at the prisoner the beery breath of a whet he had taken as he came along, and discharging it to mingle with the waves of the other beer, and gin, and tea, and coffee, and what not, that flowed at him, and had already broke upon the great windows behind him in an impure mist and rain. The object of all this staring and blaring was a young man of about 25, well grown and well looking, with a sunburnt cheek and a dark eye. His condition was that of a young gentleman. He was plainly dressed in black or very dark grey, and his hair, which was long and dark, was gathered in a ribbon at the back of his neck, more to be out of his way than for ornament. As an emotion of the mind will express itself through any covering of the body, so the paleness which his situation engendered came through the brown upon his cheek, showing the soul to be stronger than the sun. He was otherwise quite self-possessed, bowed to the judge, and stood quiet. The sort of interest which this man was stared and breathed at was not the sort that elevated humanity. Had he stood in peril of a less horrible sentence, there had been a chance of any one of its savage details being spared. By just so much he would have lost in his fascination. The form that was to be doomed to be so shamefully mangled was the sight. The immortal creature that was to be so butchered and torn asunder yielded the sensation. Whatever gloss the various spectators put upon the interest, according to their several arts and powers of self-deceit, the interest was, at the root of it, ogreish. "Silence in the court! Charles Darnay had yesterday pleaded not guilty to an indictment denouncing him," with infinite jingle and jangle, "for that he was a false traitor to our serene, illustrious, excellent, and so forth prince, our lord the king, by reason of his having, on divers occasions, and by divers means and ways, assisted Louis, the French king, in his wars against our said serene, illustrious, excellent, and so forth, that is to say, by coming and going between the dominions of our said serene, illustrious, excellent, and so forth, and those of the said French Louis, and wickedly, falsely, traitorously, and otherwise evil adverbiusly revealing to the said French Louis what forces our said serene, illustrious, excellent, and so forth had in preparation to send to Canada and North America." This much Jerry, with his head becoming more and more spiky as the law terms bristled it, made out with huge satisfaction, and so arrived circuitously at the understanding that the aforesaid, and over again aforesaid, Charles Darnay stood there before him upon his trial, that the jury was swearing in, and that Mr. Attorney General was making ready to speak. The accused, who was, and who knew he was, being mentally hanged, beheaded, and quartered by everybody there, neither flinched from the situation, nor assumed any theatrical air in it. He was quiet and attentive, watched the opening proceedings with a grave interest, and stood with his hands resting on the slab of wood before him, so composedly that they had not displaced a leaf of the herbs with which it was strewn. The court was all bestrewn with herbs and sprinkled with vinegar, as a precaution against jail air and jail fever. Over the prisoner's head there was a mirror to throw the light down upon him. Crowds of the wicked and the wretched had been reflected in it, and had passed from its surface and this earth's altogether. Haunted in a most ghastly manner that abominable place would have been, if the glass could ever have rendered back its reflections, as the ocean is one day to give up its dead. Some passing thought of the infamy and disgrace for which it had been reserved may have struck the prisoner's mind. Be that as it may, a change in his position making him conscious of a bar of light across his face, he looked up, and when he saw the glass his face flushed, and his right hand pushed the herbs away. It happened that the action turned his face to that side of the court which was on his left. About on a level with his eyes there sat in that corner of the judge's bench 2 persons, upon whom his look immediately rested, so immediately and with so much changing of his aspect, that all the eyes that were turned upon him turned to them. The spectators saw in the two figures a young lady of little more than 20, and a gentleman who was evidently her father, a man of very remarkable appearance in respect of the absolute whiteness of his hair, and a certain indescribable intensity of face, not of an active kind, but pondering and self-communing. When this expression was upon him, he looked as if he were old, but when it was stirred and broken up, as it was now, in a moment, on his speaking to his daughter, he became a handsome man, not past the prime of life. His daughter had one of her hands drawn through his arm, and she sat by him, and the other pressed upon it. She had drawn close to him in her dread of the scene, and in her pity for the prisoner. Her forehead had been strikingly expressive of an engrossing terror and compassion that saw nothing but the peril of the accused. This had been so very noticeable, so very powerfully and naturally shown, that starers who had had no pity for him were touched by her, and the whisper went about, "Who are they?" Jerry, the messenger, who made his own observations in his own manner, and who had been sucking the rust off his fingers in his absorption, stretched his neck to hear who they were. The crowd about him had pressed and passed the inquiry on to the nearest attendant, and from him it had been more slowly pressed and passed back. At last it got to Jerry. "Witnesses!" "For which side?" "Against." "Against which side?" "The prisoners." The judge, whose eyes had gone in the general direction, recalled them, leaned back against his seat, and looked steadily at the man whose life was in his hand, as Mr. Attorney General rose to spin the rope, grind the axe, and hammer the nails into the scaffold. Thus ends Book 2, Chapter 2, A Sight. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Chip in Tampa, Florida, on January 12th, 2006. A Tale of Two Cities, by Charles Dickens. Book 2, Chapter 3, A Disappointment. Mr. Attorney General had to inform the jury that the prisoner before them, though young in years, was old in the treasonable practices which claimed the forfeit of his life. That this correspondence with the public enemy was not a correspondence of to-day, or of yesterday, or even of last year, or of the year before, that it was certain the prisoner had, for longer than that, been in the habit of passing and repassing between France and England on secret business of which he could give no honest account. That, if it was the nature of traitorous ways to thrive, which happily it never was, the real wickedness and guilt of his business might have remained uncovered. That Providence, however, had put it into the heart of a person who was beyond fear and beyond reproach to ferret out the nature of this prisoner's schemes, and, struck with horror, to disclose them to his Majesty's Chief Secretary of State and most honourable Privy Council, that this patriot would be produced before them, that his position and attitude were, on the whole, sublime, that he had been the prisoner's friend, but at once, in an auspicious and an evil hour, detecting his infamy, had resolved to immolate the traitor he could no longer cherish in his bosom on the sacred altar of his country. that if statutes were decreed in Britain, as in ancient Greece and Rome, to public benefactors, this shining citizen would assuredly have had one; that, as they were not so decreed, he probably would not have one; that virtue, as had been observed by the poets in many passages which he well knew the jury would have, word for word, at the tips of their tongues, whereat the jury's countenances displayed a guilty consciousness that they knew nothing about the passages, was in a manner contagious, more especially the bright virtue known as patriotism, or love of country; that the lofty example of this immaculate and unimpeachable witness for the crown, to refer to whom, however unworthily, was an honour, had communicated itself to the prisoner's servant, and had engendered in him a holy determination to examine his master's table drawers and pockets, and secrete his papers; that he, Mr. Attorney General, was prepared to hear some disparagement attempted of this admirable servant, but that, in a general way, he preferred him to his, Mr. Attorney General's, brothers and sisters, and honoured him more than his, Mr. Attorney General's, father and mother; that he called with confidence on the jury to come and do likewise; that the evidence of these two witnesses, coupled with the documents of their discovering that would be produced, would show the prisoner to have been furnished with lists of his Majesty's forces, and of their disposition and preparation both by sea and land, that would leave no doubt that he had habitually conveyed such information to a hostile power; that these lists could not be proved to be in the prisoner's handwriting, but that it was all the same; that, indeed, it was rather the better for the prosecution, as showing the prisoner to be artful in his precautions; that the proof would go back 5 years, and would show the prisoner already engaged in these pernicious missions, within a few weeks before the date of the very first action fought between the British troops and the Americans; that, for these reasons, the jury being a loyal jury, as he knew they were, and being a responsible jury, as they knew they were, must positively find the prisoner guilty, and make an end of him, whether they liked it or not; that they never could tolerate the idea of their wives laying their heads upon their pillows; that they never could endure the notion of their children laying their heads upon their pillows; in short, that there never could be, for them or theirs, any laying of heads upon pillows at all, unless the prisoner's head was taken off. That head Mr. Attorney General concluded by demanding of them, in the name of everything he could think of with a round turn on it, and on the faith of his solemn asseveration that he had already considered the prisoner as good as dead and gone. When the Attorney General ceased, a buzz arose in the court, as if a cloud of great blue flies were swarming about the prisoner, in anticipation of what he was soon to become. When it toned down again, the unimpeachable patriot appeared in the witness box. Mr. Solicitor General then, following his leader's lead, examined the patriot, John Barsad, gentleman by name. The story of his pure soul was exactly what Mr. Attorney General had described it to be; perhaps, if it had a fault, a little too exactly. Having released his noble bosom of its burden, he would have modestly withdrawn himself, but that wigged gentleman with the papers before him, sitting not far from Mr. Lorry, begged to ask him a few questions; the wigged gentleman sitting opposite, still looking at the ceiling of the court. Had he ever been a spy himself? No, he scorned the base insinuation. What did he live upon? His property. Where was his property? He didn't precisely remember where it was. What was it? No business of anybody's. Had he inherited it? Yes, he had. From whom? Distant relation. Very distant? Rather. Ever been in prison? Certainly not. Never in a debtor's prison? Didn't see what that had to do with it. Never in a debtor's prison? Come, once again, never? Yes. How many times? 2 or 3 times. Not 5 or 6? Perhaps. Of what profession? Gentleman. Ever been kicked? Might have been. Frequently? No. Ever kicked downstairs? Decidedly not. Once received a kick on the top of a staircase, and then fell downwards of his own accord. Kicked on that occasion for cheating at dice? Something to that effect was said by the intoxicated liar who committed the assault, but it was not true. Swear that it was not true? Positively. Ever live by cheating at play? Never. Ever live by play? Not more than other gentlemen do. Ever borrow money of the prisoner? Yes. Ever pay him? No. Was not this intimacy with the prisoner in reality a very slight one, forced upon the prisoner in coaches, inns, and packets? No. Sure he saw the prisoner within the lists? Certain. Knew no more about the lists? No. Had not procured them himself, for instance? No. Expect to get anything by this evidence? No. Not in regular government pay and employment to lay traps? Oh, dear, no. Or to do anything? Oh, dear, no. Swear that? Over and over again. No motives but motives of sheer patriotism? None whatever. The virtuous servant, Roger Cly, swore his way through the case at a great rate. He had taken service with the prisoner in good faith and simplicity 4 years ago. He had asked the prisoner, aboard the Calais packet, if he wanted a handy fellow, and the prisoner had engaged him. He had not asked the prisoner to take the handy fellow as an act of charity, never thought of such a thing. He began to have suspicions of the prisoner, and to keep an eye upon him soon afterwards. In arranging his clothes while travelling, he had seen similar lists to these in the prisoner's pockets over and over again. He had taken these lists from the drawer of the prisoner's desk. He had not put them there first. He had seen the prisoner show these identical lists to French gentlemen at Calais, and similar lists to French gentlemen both at Calais and Boulogne. He loved his country, and couldn't bear it, and had given information. He had never been suspected of stealing a silver teapot. He had been maligned respecting a mustard pot, but it turned out only to be a plated one. He had known the last witnesses 7 or 8 years, but that was merely a coincidence. He didn't call it a particularly curious coincidence. Most coincidences were curious. Neither did he call it a curious coincidence that true patriotism was his only motive too. He was a true Briton, and hoped there were many like him. The blue flies buzzed again, and Mr. Attorney General called Mr. Jarvis Lorry. "Mr. Jarvis Lorry, are you a clerk in Tellson's Bank?" "I am." "On a certain Friday night in November 1775, did business occasion you to travel between London and Dover by the mail?" "It did." "Were there any other passengers in the mail?" "2." "Did they alight on the road in the course of the night?" "They did." "Mr. Lorry, look upon the prisoner. Was he one of those 2 passengers?" "I cannot undertake to say that he was." "Does he resemble either of these 2 passengers?" "Both were so wrapped up, and the night was so dark, and we are all so reserved that I cannot undertake to say even that. Mr. Lorry, look upon the prisoner. Supposing him wrapped up, as those two passengers were, is there anything in his bulk and stature to render it unlikely that he was one of them? No. You will not swear, Mr. Lorry, that he was not one of them? No. So at least you say he may have been one of them? Yes, except that I remember them both to have been, like myself, timorous of highwaymen, and the prisoner has not a timorous air. Did you ever see a counterfeit of timidity, Mr. Lorry? I certainly have seen that. Mr. Lorry, look upon the prisoner once more. Have you seen him, to your certain knowledge, before? I have. When? I was returning from France a few days afterwards, and at Calais the prisoner came aboard the packet ship in which I returned, and made the voyage with me. At what hour did he come on board? At a little after midnight. In the dead of night. Was he the only passenger who came on board at that untimely hour? He happened to be the only one. Never mind about happening, Mr. Lorry. He was the only passenger who came on board in the dead of night? He was. Were you travelling alone, Mr. Lorry, or with any companion? With two companions, a gentleman and a lady. They are here. They are here. Had you any conversation with the prisoner? Hardly any. The weather was stormy, and the passage long and rough, and I lay on a sofa almost from shore to shore. Miss Manette. The young lady, to whom all eyes had been turned before, and were now turned again, stood up where she had sat. Her father rose with her, and kept her hand drawn through his arm. Miss Manette, look upon the prisoner. To be confronted with such pity and such earnest youth and beauty was far more trying to the accused than to be confronted with all the crowd. Standing, as it were, apart with her on the edge of his grave, not all the staring curiosity that looked on could for the moment nerve him to remain quite still. His hurried right hand parcelled out the herbs before him into imaginary beds of flowers in a garden, and his efforts to control and steady his breathing shook the lips from which the colour rushed to his heart. The buzz of the great flies was loud again. Miss Manette, have you seen the prisoner before?
Yes, sir.
Where?
On board the packet ship just now referred to, sir, and on the same occasion.
You are the young lady just now referred to?
Oh, most unhappily I am.
The plaintive tone of her compassion merged into the less musical voice of the judge, as he said something fiercely. Answer the questions put to you, and make no remark upon them. Miss Manette, had you any conversation with the prisoner on that passage across the channel?
Yes, sir.
Recall it. In the midst of a profound stillness, she faintly began,
When the gentleman came on board.
Do you mean the prisoner? Inquired the judge, knitting his brows.
Yes, my lord.
Then say the prisoner.
When the prisoner came on board, he noticed that my father,
turning her eyes lovingly to him as he stood beside her,
was much fatigued and in a very weak state of health. My father was so reduced that I was afraid to take him out of the air, and I had made a bed for him on the deck near the cabin steps, and I sat on the deck at his side to take care of him. There were no other passengers that night but we four. The prisoner was so good as to beg permission to advise me how I could shelter my father from the wind and the weather better than I had done.
I had not known how to do it well, not understanding how the wind would set when we were out of the harbor. He did it for me. He expressed great kindness, and kindness for my father's state, and I'm sure he felt it. That was the manner of our beginning to speak together." "Let me interrupt you a moment. Had he come on board alone?"
"No."
"How many were with him?"
"2 French gentlemen."
"Had they conferred together?"
"They had conferred together until the last moment, when it was necessary for the French gentlemen to be landed in their boat."
"Had any papers been handed about among them, similar to these lists?"
"Some papers were handed among them, but I don't know what papers."
"Like these in shape and size?"
"Possibly, but indeed I don't know, although they stood whispering very near to me, because they stood at the top of the cabin steps to have the light of the lamp that was hanging there. It was a dull lamp, and they spoke very low, and I did not hear what they said, and saw only that they looked at papers."
"Now on to the prisoner's conversation, Miss Manette."
"The prisoner was as open as in his confidence with me, which arose out of my helpless situation, and he was kind and good and useful to my father. I hope," bursting into tears, "I may not repay him by doing him harm today."
Buzzing from the blue flies. "Miss Manette, if the prisoner does not perfectly understand that you give evidence which it is your duty to give, which you must give, and which you cannot escape from giving, with great unwillingness, he is the only person present in that condition. Please to go on."
"He told me that he was travelling on business of a delicate and difficult nature, which might get people into trouble, and that he was therefore travelling under an assumed name. He said that his business had, within a few days, taken him to France, and might at intervals take him backwards and forwards between France and England for a long time to come."
"Did he say anything about America, Miss Manette? Be particular."
"He tried to explain to me how that quarrel had arisen, and he had said that, so far as he could judge, it was a wrong and foolish one on England's part. He added, in a jesting way, that perhaps George Washington might gain almost as great a name in history as George III. But there was no harm in his way of saying this. It was said laughingly, and to beguile the time."
Any strongly marked expression of face on the part of a chief actor in a scene of great interest, to whom all eyes are directed, will be unconsciously imitated by the spectators. Her forehead was painfully anxious and intent as she gave this evidence, and in the pauses when she stopped for the judge to write it down, watched its effect upon the counsel for and against. Among the lookers-on there was the same expression in all quarters of the court, insomuch that a great majority of the foreheads there might have been mirrors reflecting the witness, when the judge, looking up from his notes to glare at that tremendous heresy at George Washington. Mr. Attorney General now signified to my lord that he deemed it necessary, as a matter of precaution and form, to call the young lady's father, Dr. Manette, who was called accordingly. "Dr. Manette, look upon the prisoner. Have you seen him before?"
"Once, when he called at my lodgings in London, some 3 years or 3½ years ago."
"Can you identify him as your fellow passenger on board the packet, or speak to his conversation with your daughter?"
"Sir, I can do neither."
"Is there any particular and special reason for your being unable to do either?"
He answered in a low voice, "There is."
Has it been your misfortune to undergo a long imprisonment without trial or even accusation in your native country, Dr. Manette?" He answered in a tone that went to every heart, "A long imprisonment." "Were you newly released on the occasion in question?" "They tell me so." "Have you no remembrance of the occasion?" "None. My mind is a blank. From some time, I cannot even say what time, when I employed myself in my captivity in making shoes, to the time when I found myself living in London with my dear daughter here. She had become familiar to me when a gracious God restored my faculties, but I am quite unable even to say how she had become familiar. I have no remembrance of the process." Mr. Attorney General sat down, and the father and daughter sat down together. A singular circumstance then arose in the case, the object in hand being to show that the prisoner went down with some fellow plotter untracked in the Dover mail on that Friday night in November 5 years ago, and had got out of the mail in the night as a blind at some place where he did not remain, but from which he travelled back some dozen miles or more to a garrison and dockyard, and there collected information. A witness was called to identify him as having been at the precise time required in the coffee-room of an hotel in that garrison and dockyard town, waiting for another person. The prisoner's counsel was cross-examining the witness with no result, except that he had never seen the prisoner on any other occasion, when the wigged gentleman, who had all this time been looking up at the ceiling of the court, wrote a word or two on a little piece of paper, screwed it up, and tossed it to him. Opening this piece of paper in the next pause, the counsel looked with great attention and curiosity at the prisoner. "You say again you are quite sure it was the prisoner?" The witness was quite sure. "Did you ever see anybody very like the prisoner?" "Not so like," the witness said, "as that he could be mistaken." "Look well upon that gentleman, my learned friend there," pointing to him who had tossed the paper over, "and then look well upon the prisoner. How say you? Are they very like each other?" Allowing for my learned friend's appearance being careless and slovenly, if not debauched, they were sufficiently like each other to surprise not only the witness, but everybody present, when they were thus brought into comparison. My lord, being prayed to bid my learned friend lay aside his wig, and giving no very gracious consent, the likeness became more remarkable. My lord inquired of Mr. Stryver, the prisoner's counsel, whether they were next to try Mr. Carton, the name of my learned friend, for treason. Mr. Stryver replied to my lord, no, but that he would ask the witness to tell him whether what had happened once might happen twice, whether he could have been so confident if he had seen this illustration of his rashness sooner, whether he would be so confident having seen it, and more, the upshot of which was to smash this witness like a crockery vessel, and shiver his part of the case to useless lumber. Mr. Cruncher had by this time taken quite a lunch of rust off his fingers in the following of the evidence. He had now to attend while Mr. Stryver fitted the prisoner's case on the jury, like a compact suit of clothes, showing them how the patriot Barsad was a hired spy and traitor, an unblushing trafficker in blood, and one of the greatest scoundrels upon the earth since accursed Judas, which he certainly did look rather like; how the virtuous servant Cly was his friend and partner, and was worthy to be; how watchful eyes of these forgers and false swearers had rested upon the prisoner as a victim, because some family affairs in France, he being of French extraction, did require his making those passages across the Channel, though what those affairs were, a consideration for others who were near and dear to him forbade him even for his life to disclose. How the evidence that had been warped and wrested from the young lady, whose anguish in giving it they had witnessed, come to nothing, involving the mere little innocent gallantries and politenesses likely to pass between any young gentleman and young lady so thrown together, with the exception of that reference to George Washington, which was altogether too extravagant and impossible to regard in any light other than as a monstrous joke. How it would be a weakness in the government to break down in this attempt to practise for popularity on the lowest national antipathies and fears, and therefore Mr. Attorney General had made the most of it. How, nevertheless, it rested upon nothing, save that vile and infamous character of evidence too often disfiguring such cases, and of which state trials in this country were full. But there my lord interposed, with as grave a face as if it had not been true, saying that he could not sit upon that bench and suffer those allusions. Mr. Stryver then called his few witnesses, and Mr. Cruncher had next to attend, while Mr. Attorney General turned the whole suit of clothes Mr. Stryver had fitted on the jury inside out, showing how Barsad and Clive were even 100 times better than he had thought them, and that the prisoner 100 times worse. Lastly came my lord himself, turning the suit of clothes now inside out, now outside in, but on the whole decidedly trimming and shaping them into grave clothes for the prisoner. And now the jury turned to consider, and the great flies swarmed again. Mr. Carton, who had so long sat looking at the ceiling of the court, changed neither his place nor his attitude, even in this excitement, while his teamed friend, Mr. Stryver, messing his papers before him, whispered with those who sat near, and from time to time glanced anxiously at the jury, while all the spectators moved, more or less, and grouped themselves anew, while even my lord himself rose from his seat, and slowly paced up and down his platform, not unattended by a suspicion in the minds of the audience that his state was feverish. This one man sat leaning back, with his torn gown half off him, his untidy wig put on just as it happened to fight on his head after its removal, his hands in his pockets, and his eyes on the ceiling as they had been all day. Something especially reckless in his demeanour not only gave him a disreputable look, but so diminished the strong resemblance he undoubtedly bore to the prisoner, which his momentary earnestness, when they were compared together, had strengthened, that many of the lookers-on, taking note of him now, said to one another that they would hardly have thought the two were so alike. Mr. Cruncher made the observation to his next neighbour, and added, "I'd hold half a guinea that he doesn't have no law work to do. Doesn't look like the sort of one to get any, do he?" Yet this Mr. Carton took in more of the details of the scene than he appeared to take in, for now, when Miss Manette's head dropped upon her father's breast, he was the first to see it, and to say audibly, "Officer, look to that young lady. Help the gentleman to take her out. Don't you see she will fall?" There was much commiseration for her as she was removed, and much sympathy with her father. It had evidently been a great distress to him to have the days of his imprisonment recalled. He had shown strong internal agitation when he was questioned, and that pondering or brooding look which made him old had been upon him like a heavy cloud ever since. As he passed out, the jury, who had turned back and paused a moment, spoke through their foreman. They were not agreed, and wished to retire. My lord, perhaps with George Washington on his mind, showed some surprise that they were not agreed, but signified his pleasure that they should retire under watch and ward, and retired himself. The trial had lasted all day, and the lamps in the court were now being lighted. It began to be rumoured that the jury would be out a long while. The spectators dropped off to get refreshment, and the prisoner withdrew to the back of the dock and sat down. Mr. Lorry, who had gone out when the young lady and her father went out, now reappeared, and beckoned to Jerry, who, in the slackened interest, could easily get near him. "Jerry, if you wish to take something to eat, you can, but keep in the way. You will be sure to hear when the jury come in. Don't be a moment behind them, for I want you to take the verdict back to the bank. You are the quickest messenger I know, and will get to Temple Bar long before I can." Jerry had just enough forehead to knuckle, and he knuckled it in acknowledgment of this communication and a shilling. Mr. Carton came up at that moment and touched Mr. Lorry on the arm. "How is the young lady?" "She is greatly distressed, but her father is comforting her, and she feels better for being out of court." "I'll tell the prisoner so. It wouldn't do for a respectable bank gentleman like you to be seen speaking to him publicly, you know." Mr. Lorry reddened as if he were conscious of having debated the point in his mind, and Mr. Carton made his way outside of the bar. The way out of court lay in that direction, and Jerry followed him, all eyes, ears, and spikes. "Mr. Darnay," the prisoner came forward directly. "You will naturally be anxious to hear of the witness, Miss Manette. She will do very well. You have seen the worst of her agitation." "I am deeply sorry to have been the cause of it. Could you tell her so for me, with my fervent acknowledgments?" "Yes, I could. I will, if you ask it." Mr. Carton's manner was so careless as to be almost insolent. He stood half turned from the prisoner, lounging with his elbow against the bar. "I do ask it. Accept my cordial thanks." "What," said Carton, still only half turned toward him, "do you expect, Mr. Darnay?" "The worst." "That is the wisest thing to expect, and the likeliest. But I think their withdrawing is in your favour." Loitering on the way out of court not being allowed, Jerry heard no more, but left them, so like each other in feature, so unlike each other in manner, standing side by side, both reflected in the glass above them. An hour and a half limped heavily away in the thief and rascal crowded passages below, even though assisted off with mutton pies and ale. The hoarse messenger, uncomfortably seated on a form after taking that refection, had dropped into a doze, with a loud murmur and a rapid tide of people setting up the stairs that led to the court, carried him along with them. "Jerry! Jerry!" Mr. Lorry was already calling at the door when he got there. "Here, sir. It's a fight to get back again. Here I am, sir." Mr. Lorry handed him a paper through the throng. "Quick, have you got it?" "Yes, sir." Hastily written on the paper was the word "acquitted." "If you had sent the message, recalled to life again," muttered Jerry as he turned, "I should have known what you meant this time." He had no opportunity of saying, or so much as thinking, anything else, until he was clear of the Old Bailey, for the crowd came pouring out with a vehemence that nearly took him off his legs, and a loud buzz swept into the street, as if the baffled blue flies were dispersing in search of other carrion. Thus ends Book 2, Chapter 3, A Disappointment.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Kara Schallenberg, www.kray.org. A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Book 2, Chapter 4. Congratulatory. From the dimly lighted passages of the court, the last sediment of the human stew that had been boiling there all day was straining off, when Dr. Manette, Lucie Manette, his daughter, Mr. Lorry, the solicitor for the defence, and its counsel, Mr. Stryver, stood gathered round Mr. Charles Darnay, just released, congratulating him on his escape from death. It would have been difficult by a far brighter light to recognize in Dr. Manette, intellectual of face and upright of bearing, the shoemaker of the garret in Paris. Yet no one could have looked at him twice without looking again, even though the opportunity of observation had not extended to the mournful cadence of his low grave voice, and to the abstraction that overclouded him fitfully, without any apparent reason. While one external cause, and that a reference to his long-lingering agony, would always, as on the trial, evoke this condition from the depths of his soul, it was also in its nature to arise of itself, and to draw a gloom over him as incomprehensible to those unacquainted with his story, as if they had seen the shadow of the actual Bastille thrown upon him by a summer sun, when the substance was 300 miles away. Only his daughter had the power of charming this black brooding from his mind. She was the golden thread that united him to a past beyond his misery, and to a present beyond his misery, and the sound of her voice, the light of her face, the touch of her hand, had a strong beneficial influence with him almost always. Not absolutely always, for she could recall some occasions on which her power had failed, but they were few and slight, and she believed them over. Mr. Darnay had kissed her hand fervently and gratefully, and had turned to Mr. Stryver, whom he warmly thanked. Mr. Stryver, a man of little more than 30, but looking 20 years older than he was, stout, loud, red, bluff, and free from any drawback of delicacy, had a pushing way of shouldering himself, morally and physically, into companies and conversations that argued well for his shouldering his way up in life. He still had his wig and gown on, and he said, squaring himself at his late client to that degree that he squeezed the innocent Mr. Lorry clean out of the group, "I am glad to have brought you off with honour, Mr. Darnay. It was an infamous prosecution, grossly infamous, but not the less likely to succeed on that account." "You have laid me under an obligation to you for life, in 2 senses," said his late client, taking his hand. "I have done my best for you, Mr. Darnay, and my best is as good as another man's, I believe." It clearly being incumbent on some one to say, "Much better," Mr. Lorry said it, perhaps not quite disinterestedly, but with the interested object of squeezing himself back in again. "You think so?" said Mr. Stryver. "Well, you have been present all day, and you ought to know. You are a man of business, too. And as such," quoth Mr. Lorry, whom the counsel learned in the law had now shouldered back into the group, just as he had previously shouldered him out of it, "as such I will appeal to Dr. Manette to break up this conference and order us all to our homes. Miss Lucie looks ill. Mr. Darnay has had a terrible day. We are worn out." "Speak for yourself, Mr. Lorry," said Stryver. "I have a night's work to do yet. Speak for yourself." "I speak for myself," answered Mr. Lorry, "and for Mr. Darnay, and for Miss Lucie, and... Miss Lucie, do you not think I may speak for us all?" He asked her the question pointedly, and with a glance at her father. His face had become frozen, as it were, in a very curious look at Darnay, an intent look, deepening into a frown of dislike and distrust, not even unmixed with fear. With this strange expression on him, his thoughts had wandered away. "My father," said Lucie, softly laying her hand on his. He slowly shook the shadow off and turned to her. "Shall we go home, my father?" With a long breath he answered, "Yes." The friends of the acquitted prisoner had dispersed, under the impression, which he himself had originated, that he would not be released that night. The lights were nearly all extinguished in the passages, the iron gates were being closed with a jar and a rattle, and the dismal place was deserted until to-morrow morning's interest of gallows, pillory, whipping-post, and branding-iron should repeople it. Walking between her father and Mr. Darnay, Lucie Manette passed into the open air. A hackney coach was called, and the father and daughter departed in it. Mr. Stryver had left them in the passages, to shoulder his way back to the robing-room. Another person who had not joined the group, or interchanged a word with any one of them, but who had been leaning against the wall where its shadow was darkest, had silently strolled out after the rest, and had looked on until the coach drove away. He now stepped up to where Mr. Lorry and Mr. Darnay stood upon the pavement. "So, Mr. Lorry, men of business may speak to Mr. Darnay now?" Nobody had made any acknowledgment of Mr. Carton's part in the day's proceedings. Nobody had known of it. He was unrobed, and was none the better for it in appearance. If you knew what a conflict goes on in the business mind, when the business mind is divided between good-natured impulse and business appearances, you would be amused, Mr. Darnay. Mr. Lorry reddened and said warmly, "You have mentioned that before, sir. We men of business, who serve a house, are not our own masters. We have to think of the house more than ourselves." "I know," rejoined Mr. Carton, carelessly. "Don't be nettled, Mr. Lorry. You are as good as another, I have no doubt. Better, I dare say." "And indeed, sir," pursued Mr. Lorry, not minding him, "I really don't know what you have to do with the matter. If you'll excuse me, as very much your elder, for saying so, I really don't know that it is your business." "Business? Bless you, I have no business," said Mr. Carton. "It is a pity you have not, sir." "I think so too." "If you had," pursued Mr. Lorry, "perhaps you would attend to it." "Lord love you, no, I shouldn't," said Mr. Carton. "Well, sir," cried Mr. Lorry, thoroughly heated by his indifference, "business is a very good thing, and a very respectable thing, and, sir, if business imposes its restraints, and its silences and impediments, Mr. Darnay, as a young gentleman of generosity, knows how to make allowance for that circumstance. Mr. Darnay, good night. God bless you, sir. I hope you have been this day preserved for a prosperous and happy life. Chair there!" Perhaps a little angry with himself, as well as with the barrister, Mr. Lorry bustled into the chair, and was carried off to Tellson's. Carton, who smelt of port wine and did not appear to be quite sober, laughed then, and turned to Darnay. "This is a strange chance that throws you and me together. This must be a strange night to you, standing alone here with your counterpart on these street stones." "I hardly seem yet," returned Charles Darnay, "to belong to this world again." "I don't wonder at it. It's not so long since you were pretty far advanced on your way to another. You speak faintly." "I begin to think I am faint." "Then why the devil don't you dine? I dined myself while those numbskulls were deliberating which world you should belong to, this or some other. Let me show you the nearest tavern to dine well at." Drawing his arm through his own, he took him down Ludgate Hill to Fleet Street, and so up a covered way into a tavern. Here they were shown into a little room, where Charles Darnay was soon recruiting his strength with a good plain dinner and good wine, while Carton sat opposite to him at the same table, with his separate bottle of port before him, and his fully half-insolent manner upon him. "Do you feel yet that you belong to this terrestrial scheme again, Mr. Darnay?" "I am frightfully confused regarding time and place, but I am so far mended as to feel that." "It must be an immense satisfaction." He said it bitterly, and filled up his glass again, which was a large one. "As to me, the greatest desire I have is to forget that I belong to it. It has no good in it for me, except wine like this, nor I for it. So we are not much alike in that particular. Indeed, I begin to think we are not much alike in any particular, you and I." Confused by the emotion of the day, and feeling his being there with this double of coarse deportment to be like a dream, Charles Darnay was at a loss how to answer. Finally, answered not at all. "Now your dinner is done," Carton presently said. "Why don't you call a health, Mr. Darnay? Why don't you give your toast?" "What health? What toast?" "Why, it's on the tip of your tongue. It ought to be, it must be. I'll swear it's there." "Miss Manette, then." "Miss Manette, then." Looking his companion full in the face while he drank the toast, Carton flung his glass over his shoulder against the wall, where it shivered to pieces, then rang the bell and ordered in another. "That's a fair young lady to hand to a coach in the dark, Mr. Darnay," he said, ruing his new goblet. A slight frown and a laconic "Yes," were the answer. "That's a fair young lady to be pitied by and wept for by. How does it feel? Is it worth being tried for one's life, to be the object of such sympathy and compassion, Mr. Darnay?" Again Darnay answered not a word. "She was mightily pleased to have your message when I gave it her. Not that she showed she was pleased, but I suppose she was." The allusion served as a timely reminder to Darnay that this disagreeable companion had, of his own free will, assisted him in the strait of the day. He turned the dialogue to that point, and thanked him for it. "I neither want any thanks nor merit any," was the careless rejoinder. "It was nothing to do, in the first place, and I don't know why I did it, in the second. Mr. Darnay, let me ask you a question." "Willingly, and a small return for your good offices." "Do you think I particularly like you?" "Really, Mr. Carton," returned the other, oddly disconcerted, "I have not asked myself the question." "But ask yourself the question now." "You have acted as if you do, but I don't think you do." "I don't think I do," said Carton. "I begin to have a very good opinion of your understanding." "Nevertheless," pursued Darnay, rising to ring the bell, "there is nothing in that, I hope, to prevent my calling the reckoning, and our parting without ill blood on either side." Carton rejoining, "Nothing in life," Darnay rang. "Do you call the whole reckoning?" said Carton. On his answering in the affirmative, "Then bring me another pint of this same wine, drawer, and come and wake me at 10. The bill being paid, Charles Darnay rose and wished him good night. Without returning the wish, Carton rose too, with something of a threat of defiance in his manner, and said, "A last word, Mr. Darnay. Do you think I am drunk?" "I think you have been drinking, Mr. Carton." "Think? You know I have been drinking." "Since I must say so, I know it." Then you shall likewise know why. I am a disappointed drudge, sir. I care for no man on earth, and no man on earth cares for me. Much to be regretted. You might have used your talents better. May be so, Mr. Darnay, may be not. Don't let your sober face elate you, however. You don't know what it may come to. Good night. When he was left alone, this strange being took up a candle, went to a glass that hung against the wall, and surveyed himself minutely in it. "Do you particularly like the man?" he muttered at his own image. "Why should you particularly like a man who resembles you? There is nothing in you to like, you know that. Ah, confound you, what a change you have made in yourself! A good reason for taking to a man, that he shows you what you have fallen away from, and what you might have been. Change places with him, and would you have been looked at by those blue eyes as he was, and commiserated by that agitated face as he was? Come on, and have it out in plain words. You hate the fellow." He resorted to his pint of wine for consolation, drank it all in a few minutes, and fell asleep on his arms, with his hair straggling over the table, and a long winding sheet in the candle dripping down upon him. End of Book 2, Chapter 4. Read by Kara Schallenberg on January 26th, 2006, in Oceanside, California.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Chip in Tampa, Florida, on January 13th, 2006. A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Book 2, Chapter 5, The Jackal. Those were drinking days, and most men drank hard. So very great is the improvement time has brought about in such habits that a moderate statement of the quantity of wine and punch which one man would swallow in the course of a night without any detriment to his reputation as a perfect gentleman would seem in these days a ridiculous exaggeration. The learned profession of the law was certainly not behind any other learned profession in its bacchanalian propensities. Neither was Mr. Stryver, already fast shouldering his way to a large and lucrative practice, behind his compeers in this particular, any more than in the drier parts of the legal race. A favourite at the Old Bailey, and eke at the Sessions, Mr. Stryver had begun cautiously to hew away at the lower staves of the ladder on which he mounted. Sessions and the Old Bailey had now to summon their favourite specially to their longing arms, and, shouldering itself toward the visage of the Lord Chief Justice in the Court of King's Bench, the florid countenance of Mr. Stryver might be daily seen, bursting out of a bed of wigs like a great sunflower, pushing its way at the sun from among a rank gardenful of flaring companions. It had once been noted at the bar that while Mr. Stryver was a glib man, and an unscrupulous, and a ready, and a bold, that he had not that faculty of extracting the essence from a heap of statements, which is among the most striking and necessary of the advocate's accomplishments. But a remarkable improvement came upon him as to this. The more business he got, the greater his power seemed to grow of getting at the pith and marrow, and however late at night he sat carousing with Sydney Carton, he always had his points at his fingers' end in the morning. Sydney Carton, idlest and most unpromising of men, was Stryver's great ally. What the two drank together between Hilary Term and Michaelmas might have floated a king's ship. Stryver never had a case in his hand anywhere, but Carton was there, with his hands in his pockets, staring at the ceiling of the court. They went to the same circuit, and even there they prolonged their usual orgies late into the night, and Carton was rumoured to be seen at broad day going home stealthily and unsteadily to his lodgings like a dissipated cat. At last it began to get about, among such as were interested in the matter, that although Sydney Carton would never be a lion, he was an amazingly good jackal, and that he rendered suit and service to Stryver in that humble capacity. 10 o'clock, sir, said the man at the tavern, whom he had charged to wake him. 10 o'clock, sir. What's the matter? 10 o'clock, sir. What do you mean, 10 o'clock at night? Yes, sir, your honour told me to call you. Oh, I remember. Very well, very well. After a few dull efforts to get to sleep again, which the man dexterously combated by stirring the fire continuously for 5 minutes, he got up, tossed his hat on, and walked out. He turned into the Temple, and having revived himself by twice pacing the pavements of King's Bench Walk and Paper Buildings, turned into the Stryver chambers. The Stryver clerk, who never assisted at these conferences, had gone home, and the Stryver principal opened the door. He had his slippers on, and a loose bedgown, and his throat was bare for his greater ease. He had that rather wild, strained, seared marking about his eyes, which may be observed in all free livers of his class, from the portrait of Jeffreys downward, and which can be traced under various disguises of art through the portraits of every drinking age. "You're a little late, Memory," said Stryver. "About the usual time. It may be a quarter of an hour later." They went into a dingy room lined with books and littered with papers, where there was a blazing fire. A kettle steamed upon the hob, and in the midst of the wreck of papers a table shone, with plenty of wine upon it, and brandy, and rum, and sugar, and lemons. "You have had your bottle, I perceive, Sydney." "2 to-night, I think. I've been dining with the day's client, or seeing him dine, it's all one." "That was a rare point, Sydney, that you brought to bear upon the identification. How came you by it? When did it strike you?" "I thought he was a rather handsome fellow, and I thought I should have been much the same sort of fellow, if I'd had any luck." Mr. Stryver laughed till he shook his precocious paunch. "You and your luck, Sydney. Get to work, get to work." Sullenly enough, the Jackal loosed his dress, went into an adjoining room, and came back with a large jug of cold water, a basin, and a towel or two. Steeping the towels in the water, and partially wringing them out, he folded them on his head in a manner hideous to behold, sat down at the table, and said, "Now I am ready." "Not much boiling down to be done to-night, Memory," said Mr. Stryver gaily, as he looked among his papers. "How much?" "Only 2 sets of them." "Give me the worst first." "There they are, Mr. Sydney. Fire away." The lion then composed himself on his back on a sofa on one side of the drinking-table, while the Jackal sat at his own paper-bestrewn table proper, on the other side of it, with the bottles and glasses ready to his hand. Both resorted to the drinking-table without stint, but each in a different way, the lion for the most part reclining with his hands in his waistband, looking at the fire, or occasionally flirting with some lighter document. The Jackal, with knitted brows and intent face, so deep in his task that his eyes did not even follow the hand he stretched out for the glass, which often groped about for a minute or more before he found the glass where his lips. 2 or 3 times the matter in his hand became so knotty that the Jackal found it imperative on him to get up and steep the towels anew. From these pilgrimages to the jug and basin he returned, with such eccentricities of damp headgear as no words can describe, which were made more ludicrous by his anxious gravity. At length the Jackal had got together a compact repast for the lion, and proceeded to offer it to him. The lion took it with care and caution, made his selections from it, and his remarks upon it, and the Jackal assisted both. When the repast was fully discussed, the lion put his hands in his waistband again, and lay down to meditate. The Jackal then invigorated himself with a bum for his throttle, and a fresh application to his head, and applied himself to the collection of a second meal. This was administered to the lion in the same manner, and was not disposed of until the clock struck 3 in the morning. "And now we have done, Sydney. Fill a bumper of punch," said Mr. Stryver. The Jackal removed the towels from his head, which had been steaming again, shook himself, yawned, shivered, and complied. "You were very sound, Sydney, in the matter of the 3 Crown witnesses today, every question told. I am always sound, am I not? I don't gainsay it. Which has roughened your temper. Put some punch into it, and smooth it again." With a deprecatory grunt, the Jackal again complied. "The old Sydney Carton of old Shrewsbury School," said Stryver, nodding his head over him as he reviewed him in the present and the past. "The old see-saw Sydney, 1 minute up, down the next. Now in spirits, and now in despondency." "Ah!" returned the other, sighing. "Yes, the same Sydney, with the same luck. Even then I did exercises for the other boys, and seldom did my own. And why not? God knows. It was my way, I suppose." He sat with his hands in his pockets and his legs stretched out before him, looking at the fire. "Carton," said his friend, squaring himself at him with a bullying air, as if the fire-grate had been the furnace in which sustained endeavour was forged, and the one delicate thing to be done for the old Sydney Carton of old Shrewsbury School was to shoulder him into it. "Your way is, and always was, a lame way. You summon no energy and purpose. Look at me." "Oh, botheration!" returned Sydney, with a lighter and more good-humoured laugh. "Don't you be moral." "How have I done what I have done?" said Stryver. "How do I do what I do?" "Partly through paying me to help you, I suppose. But it's not worth your while to apostrophize me on the air about it. What you want to do, you do. You were always in the front rank, and I was always behind." "I had to get to the front rank. I was not born there, was I?" "I was not present at the ceremony, but my opinion is you were," said Carton. At this he laughed again, and they both laughed. "Before Shrewsbury, and at Shrewsbury, and ever since Shrewsbury," pursued Carton, "you have fallen into your rank, and I have fallen into mine. Even then we were fellow-students in the student quarter of Paris, picking up French and French law, and other French crumbs that we didn't get much good of. You were always somewhere, and I was always nowhere." "And whose fault was that? Upon my soul, I am not sure that it was not yours. You were always driving and riving and shouldering and passing, to that restless degree that I had no chance for my life but in rust and repose. It's a gloomy thing, however, to talk about one's own past with the day breaking. Turn me in some other direction before I go." "Well, then, pledge me to the pretty witness," said Stryver, holding up his glass. "Are you turned in a pleasant direction?" Apparently not, for he became gloomy again. "Pretty witness," he muttered, looking down into his glass. "I have had enough of witnesses to-day and to-night. Who's your pretty witness?" "The picturesque doctor's daughter, Miss Manette." "She pretty?" "Is she not?" "No." "Why, man alive, she was the admiration of the whole court." "Rot the admiration of the whole court! Who made the Old Bailey a judge of beauty? She was a golden-haired doll." "Do you know, Sydney," said Mr. Stryver, looking at him with sharp eyes, and slowly drawing a hand across his florid face, "do you know, I rather thought at the time that you sympathized with the golden-haired doll, and were quick to see what happened to the golden-haired doll. Quick to see what happened! If a girl, doll or no doll, swoons within a yard or two of a man's nose, he can see it without a perspective glass. I pledge you, but I deny the beauty. And now I'll have no more to drink. I'll get to bed." When his host followed him out on the staircase with a candle to light him down the stairs, the day was coldly looking in through its grimy windows. When he got out of the house, the air was cold and sad, the dull sky overcast, the river dark and dim, the whole scene like a lifeless desert. and wreaths of dust were spinning round and round before the morning blast, as if the desert sand had risen far away, and the first spray of it, on its advance, had begun to overwhelm the city. Waste forces within him, and a desert all round, this man stood still on his way to a silent terrace, and saw, for a moment, lying in the wilderness before him, a mirage of honourable ambition, self-denial, and perseverance. In the fair city of his vision there were airy galleries from which the loves and graces looked upon him, gardens in which the fruits of life hung ripening, waters of hope that sparkled in his sight. A moment, and it was gone. Climbing to a high chamber in a well of houses, he threw himself down in his clothes on a neglected bed, and its pillow was wet with wasted tears. Sadly, sadly the sun rose. It rose upon no sadder a sight than the man of good abilities and good emotions, incapable of their directed exercise, incapable of his own help and his own happiness, sensible of the blight on him, and resigning himself to let it eat him away. Thus ends Book 2, Chapter 5, The Jackal.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Book the Second, The Golden Thread. Chapter 6, Hundreds of People. The quiet lodgings of Dr. Manette were in a quiet street corner not far from Soho Square. On the afternoon of a certain fine Sunday, when the waves of 4 months had roiled over the trial for treason, and carried it, as to the public interest and memory, far out to sea, Mr. Jarvis Lorry walked along the sunny streets from Clerkenwell, where he lived, on his way to dine with the doctor. After several relapses into business absorption, Mr. Lorry had become the doctor's friend, and the quiet street corner was the sunny part of his life. On this certain fine Sunday, Mr. Lorry walked towards Soho, early in the afternoon, for 3 reasons of habit. Firstly, because on fine Sundays he often walked out before dinner with the doctor and Lucie. Secondly, because on unfavourable Sundays he was accustomed to be with them as the family friend, talking, reading, looking out of window, and generally getting through the day. Thirdly, because he happened to have his own little shrewd doubts to solve, and knew how the ways of the doctor's household pointed to that time as a likely time for solving them. A quainter corner than the corner where the doctor lived was not to be found in London. There was no way through it, and the front windows of the doctor's lodgings commanded a pleasant little vista of street that had a congenial air of retirement on it. There were few buildings then, north of the Oxford Road, and forest trees flourished, and wild flowers grew, and the hawthorn blossomed in the now vanished fields. As a consequence, country air circulated in Soho with vigorous freedom, instead of languishing into the parish like stray paupers without a settlement. And there was many a good south wall not far off, on which the peaches ripened in their season. The summer light struck into the corner brilliantly in the earlier part of the day, but, when the streets grew hot, the corner was in shadow, though not in shadow so remote that you could not see beyond it into a glare of brightness. It was a cool spot, staid but cheerful, a wonderful place for echoes, and a very harbour from the raging streets. There ought to have been a tranquil bark in such an anchorage, and there was. The doctor occupied 2 floors of a large stiff house, where several callings purported to be pursued by day, but whereof little was audible any day, and which was shunned by all of them at night. In a building at the back, attainable by a courtyard where a plane tree rustled its green leaves, church organs claimed to be made, and silver to be chased, and likewise gold to be beaten by some mysterious giant who had a golden arm starting out of the wall of the front hall, as if he had beaten himself precious, and menaced a similar conversion of all visitors. Very little of these trades, or of a lonely lodger rumoured to live upstairs, or of a dim coach-trimming maker asserted to have a counting-house below, was ever heard or seen. Occasionally a stray workman putting his coat on traversed the hall, or a stranger peered about there, or a distant clink was heard across the courtyard, or a thump from the golden giant. These, however, were only the exceptions required to prove the rule that the sparrows in the plane tree behind the house, and the echoes in the corner before it, had their own way from Sunday morning unto Saturday night. Dr. Manette received such patience here as his old reputation, and its revival in the floating whispers of his story, brought him. His scientific knowledge, and his vigilance and skill in conducting ingenious experiments, brought him otherwise into moderate request, and he earned as much as he wanted. These things were within Mr. Jarvis Lorry's knowledge, thoughts, and notice when he rang the doorbell of the tranquil house in the corner on the fine Sunday afternoon. Dr. Manette at home? Expected home. Miss Lucie at home? Expected home. Miss Pross at home? Possibly at home, but of a certainty impossible for a handmaid to anticipate intentions of Miss Pross as to admission or denial of the fact. "As I am at home myself," said Mr. Lorry, "I'll go upstairs." Although the doctor's daughter had known nothing of the country of her birth, she appeared to have innately derived from it that ability to make much of little means, which is one of its most useful and most agreeable characteristics. Simple as the furniture was, it was set off by so many little adornments, of no value but for their taste and fancy, that its effect was delightful. The disposition of everything in the rooms, from the largest object to the least, the arrangement of colours, the elegant variety and contrast attained by thrift in trifles, by delicate hands, clear eyes, and good sense, were at once so pleasant in themselves, and so expressive of their originator, that, as Mr. Lorry stood looking about him, the very chairs and tables seemed to ask him, with something of that peculiar expression which he knew so well by this time, whether he approved. There were 3 rooms on a floor, and the doors by which they communicated being put open that the air might pass freely through them all, Mr. Lorry, smilingly observant of that fanciful resemblance which he detected all around him, walked from one to another. The first was the best room, and in it were Lucie's birds, and flowers, and books, and desk, and work-table, and box of water-colours. The second was the doctor's consulting room, used also as the dining room. The third, changingly speckled by the rustle of the plane tree in the yard, was the doctor's bedroom, and there, in a corner, stood the disused shoemaker's bench and tray of tools, much as it had stood on the 5th floor of the dismal house by the wine-shop, in the suburb of Saint-Antoine in Paris. "I wonder," said Mr. Lorry, pausing in his looking about, "that he keeps that reminder of his sufferings about him." "And why wonder at that?" was the abrupt inquiry that made him start. It proceeded from Miss Pross, the wild red woman, strong of hand, whose acquaintance he had first made at the Royal George Hotel in Dover, and had since improved. "I should have thought," Mr. Lorry began. "Pooh! You'd have thought," said Miss Pross, and Mr. Lorry left off. "How do you do?" inquired the lady then, sharply, and yet as if to express that she bore him no malice. "I am pretty well, I thank you," answered Mr. Lorry, with meekness. "How are you?" "Nothing to boast of," said Miss Pross. "Indeed?" "Ah, indeed," said Miss Pross. "I am very much put out about my ladybird." "Indeed?" "For gracious sake, say something else besides indeed, or you'll fidget me to death," said Miss Pross, whose character, dissociated from stature, was shortness. "Really, then," said Mr. Lorry, as an amendment. "Really is bad enough," returned Miss Pross, "but better. Yes, I am very much put out." "May I ask the cause?" "I don't want dozens of people who are not all worthy of Ladybird to come here looking after her," said Miss Pross. "Do dozens come for that purpose?" "Hundreds," said Miss Pross. It was characteristic of this lady, as of some other people before her time and since, that whenever her original proposition was questioned, she exaggerated it. "Dear me," said Mr. Lorry, as the safest remark he could think of. "I have lived with the darling, or the darling has lived with me, and paid for it, which she certainly should never have done, you may take your affidavit, if I could have afforded to keep either myself or her for nothing, since she was 10 years old. And it's really very hard," said Miss Pross. Not seeing with precision what was very hard, Mr. Lorry shook his head, using that important part of himself as sort of a fairy cloak that could fit anything. "All sorts of people who are not in the least degree worthy of the pet are always turning up," said Miss Pross. "When you began it—" "I began it, Miss Pross?" "Didn't you? Who brought her father to life? Oh, if that was beginning it, said Mr. Lorry. It wasn't ending it, I suppose. I say, when you began it, it was hard enough. Not that I have any fault to find with Dr. Manette, except that he is not worthy of such a daughter, which is no imputation on him, for it was not to be expected that anybody should be, under any circumstances. But it is really doubly and trebly hard to have crowds and multitudes of people turning up after him. I could have forgiven him, to take Lady Bird's affections away from me. Mr. Lorry knew Miss Pross to be very jealous, but he also knew her by this time to be, beneath the service of her eccentricity, one of those unselfish creatures, found only among women, who will, for pure love and admiration, bind themselves willing slaves, to youth when they have lost it, to beauty that they never had, to accomplishments that they were never fortunate enough to gain, to bright hopes that never shone upon their own sombre lives. He knew enough of the world to know that there is nothing in it better than the faithful service of the heart, so rendered and so free from any mercenary taint. He had such an exalted respect for it, that in the retributive arrangements made by his own mind, we all make such arrangements more or less, he stationed Miss Pross much nearer to the lower angels than many ladies immeasurably better got up both by nature and art, who had balances at Tellson's. There never was nor will be but one man worthy of Lady Bird, said Miss Pross, and that was my brother Solomon, if he hadn't made a mistake in life. Here again, Mr. Lorry's inquiries into Miss Pross's personal history had established the fact that her brother Solomon was a heartless scoundrel who had stripped her of everything she possessed, as a stake to speculate with, and had abandoned her in her poverty for evermore, with no touch of compunction. Miss Pross's fidelity of belief in Solomon, deducting a mere trifle for this slight mistake, was quite a serious matter with Mr. Lorry, and had its weight in his good opinion of her. As we happen to be alone for the moment, and are both people of business, he said, when they had got back to the drawing-room and had sat down there in friendly relations, let me ask you, does the doctor, in talking with Lucie, never refer to the shoemaking time yet? Never. And yet he keeps that bench and those tools beside him? Ah, returned Miss Pross, shaking her head, but I don't say he don't refer to it within himself. Do you believe that he thinks of it much? I do, said Miss Pross. Do you imagine, Mr. Lorry had begun, when Miss Pross took him up short with, never imagine anything, have no imagination at all. I stand corrected. Do you suppose, you go so far as to suppose sometimes? Now and then, said Miss Pross. Do you suppose, Mr. Lorry went on, with a laughing twinkle in his bright eye as it looked kindly at her, that Dr. Manette has any theory of his own, preserved through all those years, relative to the cause of his being so oppressed, perhaps even to the name of his oppressor? I don't suppose anything about it but what Lady Bird tells me. And that is, that she thinks he has. Now, don't be angry at my asking all these questions, because I am a mere dull man of business, and you are a woman of business. Dull? Miss Pross inquired with placidity. Rather wishing his modest adjective away, Mr. Lorry replied, No, surely not. To return to business. Is it not remarkable that Dr. Manette, unquestionably innocent of any crime, as we all are well assured he is, should never touch upon that question? I will not say with me, though he has had business relations with me many years ago, and we are now intimate. I will say with the fair daughter to whom he is so devotedly attached, and who is so devotedly attached to him. Believe me, Miss Pross, I don't approach the subject with you out of curiosity, but out of zealous interest. Well, to the best of my understanding, and bad's the best, you'll tell me, Miss Pross softened by the tone of apology, he is afraid of the whole subject. Afraid? It's plain enough, I should think, why he may be. It's a dreadful remembrance. Besides that, his loss of himself grew out of it. Not knowing how he lost himself, or how he recovered himself, he may never feel certain of not losing himself again. That alone wouldn't make the subject pleasant, I should think. It was a profounder remark than Mr. Lorry had looked for. True, said he, and fearful to reflect upon. Yet a doubt lurks in my mind, Miss Pross, whether it is good for Dr. Manette to have that suppression always shut up within him. Indeed, it is this doubt and the uneasiness it sometimes causes me that has led me to our present confidence. Can't be helped, said Miss Pross, shaking her head. Touch that string, and he instantly changes for the worse. Better leave it alone. In short, must leave it alone, like or no. Sometimes he gets up in the dead of night, and will be heard, by us overhead there, walking up and down in his room. Ladybird has learnt to know then that his mind is walking up and down in his old prison. She hurries to him, and they go on together, walking up and down, until he is composed. But he never says a word of the true reason of his restlessness to her, as she finds it best not to hint at it to him. In silence they go walking up and down together, till her love and company have brought him to himself. Notwithstanding Miss Pross's denial of her own imagination, there was a perception of the pain of being monotonously haunted by one sad idea in her repetition of the phrase, walking up and down, which testified to her possessing such a thing. The corner has been mentioned as a wonderful corner for echoes, and it had begun to echo so resoundingly to the tread of coming feet, that it seemed as though the very mention of that weary pacing to and fro had set it going. "Here they are," said Miss Pross, rising to break up the conference, "and now we shall have hundreds of people pretty soon." It was such a curious corner in its acoustical properties, such a peculiar ear of a place, that as Mr. Lorry stood at the open window, looking for the father and daughter whose steps he heard, he fancied they would never approach. Not only would the echoes die away, as though the steps had gone, but echoes of other steps that never came would also be heard in their stead, and would die away for good when they seemed close at hand. However, father and daughter did at last appear, and Miss Pross was ready at the street door to receive them. Miss Pross was a pleasant sight, albeit wild and red and grim, taking off her darling's bonnet when she came upstairs, and touching it up with the ends of her handkerchief, and blowing the dust off it, and folding her mantle ready for laying by, and smoothing her rich hair with as much pride as she could possibly have taken in her own hair if she had been the vainest and handsomest of women. Her darling was a pleasant sight too, embracing her and thanking her, and protesting against her taking so much trouble for her, which last she only dared to do playfully, or Miss Pross, sorely hurt, would have retired to her own chamber and cried. The doctor was a pleasant sight too, looking on at them, and telling Miss Pross how she spoilt Lucie, in accents and with eyes that had as much spoiling in them as Miss Pross had, and would have had more if it were possible. Mr. Lorry was a pleasant sight too, beaming at all of this in his wig, thanking his bachelor stars for having lighted him in his declining years to a home. But no hundreds of people came to see the sights, and Mr. Lorry looked in vain for the fulfilment of Miss Pross's prediction. Dinner time, and still no hundreds of people. In the arrangements of the little household, Miss Pross took charge of the lower regions, and always acquitted herself marvellously. Her dinners, a very modest quantity, were so well cooked, and so well served, and so neat in their contrivances, half English and half French, that nothing could be better. Miss Pross's friendship being of the thoroughly practical kind, she had ravaged Soho and the adjacent provinces in search of impoverished French, who, tempted by shillings and half-crowns, would impart culinary mysteries to her. From these decayed sons and daughters of Gaul, she had acquired such wonderful arts that the woman and girl who formed the staff of domestics regarded her as quite a sorceress, or Cinderella's godmother, who would send out for a fowl, a rabbit, a vegetable or two from the garden, and change them into anything she pleased. On Sundays, Miss Pross dined at the doctor's table, but on other days persisted in taking her meals at unknown periods either in the lower regions or in her own room on the second floor, a blue chamber to which no one but her Ladybird ever gained admittance. On this occasion, Miss Pross, responding to Ladybird's pleasant face and pleasant efforts to please her, unbent exceedingly, so the dinner was very pleasant too. It was an oppressive day, and after dinner Lucie proposed that the wine should be carried out under the plane tree, and they should sit there in the air. As everything turned upon her and revolved about her, they went out under the plane tree, and she carried the wine down for the special benefit of Mr. Lorry. She had installed herself some time before as Mr. Lorry's cup-bearer, and while they sat under the plane tree talking, she kept his glass replenished. Mysterious backs and ends of houses peeped at them as they talked, and the plane tree whispered to them in its own way above their heads. Still, the hundreds of people did not present themselves. Mr. Darnay presented himself while they were sitting under the plane tree, but he was only one. Dr. Manette received him kindly, and so did Lucie. But Miss Pross suddenly became afflicted with a twitching in the head and body, and retired into the house. She was not unfrequently the victim of this disorder, and she called it, in familiar conversation, a fit of the jerks. The doctor was in his best condition, and looked specially young. The resemblance between him and Lucie was very strong at such times, and as they sat side by side, she leaning on his shoulder, and he resting his arm on the back of her chair, it was agreeable to trace the likeness. He had been talking all day on many subjects, and with unusual vivacity. "Pray, Dr. Manette," said Mr. Darnay, as they sat under the plane tree, and he said it in the natural pursuit of the topic in hand, which happened to be the old buildings of London, "have you seen much of the Tower?" "Lucie and I have been there, but only casually. We have seen enough of it to know that it teems with interest, little more." "I have been there, as you remember," said Darnay with a smile, though reddening a little angrily, "in another character, and not in a character that gives facilities for seeing much of it. They told me a curious thing when I was there." "What was that?" Lucie asked. In making some alterations, the workmen came upon an old dungeon, which had been, for many years, built up and forgotten. Every stone of its inner wall was covered by inscriptions which had been carved on by prisoners, dates, names, complaints, and prayers. Upon a corner stone in an angle of the wall, one prisoner, who seemed to have gone to execution, had cut as his last work 3 letters. They were done with some very poor instrument, and hurriedly, with an unsteady hand. At first they were read as D-I-C, but on being more carefully examined, the last letter was found to be a G. There was no record or legend of any prisoner with those initials, and many fruitless guesses were made what the names could have been. At length it was suggested that the letters were not initials, but the complete word dig. The floor was examined very carefully under the inscription, and in the earth, beneath a stone or tile or some fragment of paving, were found the ashes of a paper mingled with the ashes of a small leathern case or bag. What the unknown prisoner had written will never be read, but he had written something, and hidden it away to keep it from the gaoler. "My father!" exclaimed Lucie, "you are ill!" He had suddenly started up, with his hand to his head. His manner and his look quite terrified them all. "No, my dear, not ill. There are large drops of rain falling, and they made me start. We had better go in." He recovered himself almost instantly. Rain was really falling in large drops, and he showed the back of his hand with raindrops on it. But he said not a single word in reference to the discovery that had been told of, and, as they walked into the house, the business eye of Mr. Lorry either detected, or fancied it detected, on his face, as it turned towards Charles Darnay, the same singular look that had been upon it when it turned towards him in the passages of the court-house. He recovered himself so quickly, however, that Mr. Lorry had doubts of his business eye. The arm of the golden giant in the hall was not more steady than he was when he stopped under it to remark to them that he was not yet proof against slight surprises, if he ever would be, and that the rain had startled him. Tea time, and Miss Pross went to make tea, with another fit of the jerks upon her, and yet no hundreds of people. Mr. Carton had lounged in, but he made only 2. The night was so very sultry that although they sat with windows and doors open, they were overpowered by heat. When the tea table was done with, they all moved to one of the windows and looked out into the heavy twilight. Lucie sat by her father, Darnay sat beside her, Carton leaned against a window. The curtains were long and white, and some of the thunder gusts that whirled into the corner caught them up to the ceiling and waved them like spectral wings. "The raindrops are still falling, large, heavy, and few," said Dr. Manette. "It comes slowly." "It comes surely," said Carton. They spoke low, as people watching and waiting mostly do, as people in a dark room, watching and waiting for lightning, always do. There was a great hurry in the streets of people speeding away to get shelter before the storm broke. The wonderful corner for echoes resounded with the echoes of footsteps coming and going, yet not a footstep was there. "A multitude of people, and yet a solitude," said Darnay, when they had listened for a while. Is it not impressive, Mr. Darnay? Asked Lucie. Sometimes I have sat here of an evening until I have fancied, but even the shade of a foolish fancy makes me shudder tonight, when all is so black and solemn. Let us shudder too. We may know what it is. It will seem nothing to you. Such whims are only impressive as we originate them, I think. They are not to be communicated. I have sometimes sat alone here of an evening, listening, until I have made the echoes out to be the echoes of all the footsteps coming by and by into our lives. There is a great crowd coming one day into our lives, if that be so, Sydney Carton struck in his moody way. The footsteps were incessant, and the hurry of them became more and more rapid. The corner echoed and re-echoed with the tread of feet, some, as it seemed, under the windows, some, as it seemed, in the room, some coming, some going, some breaking off, some stopping altogether, all in the distant streets, and not one within sight. Are all these footsteps destined to come to all of us, Miss Manette? Are we to divide them among ourselves? I don't know, Mr. Darnay. I told you it was a foolish fancy, but you asked for it. When I have yielded myself to it, I have been alone, and then I have imagined them the footsteps of people who are to come into my life and my father. I take them into mine, said Carton. I ask no questions and make no stipulations. There's a great crowd bearing down upon us, Miss Manette, and I see them by the lightning. He added the last words after there had been a vivid flash which had shown him lounging in the window. And I hear them, he added again, after a peal of thunder. Here they come, fast, fierce, and furious. It was the rush and roar of rain that he typified, and it stopped him, for no voice could be heard in it. A memorable storm of thunder and lightning broke with that sweep of water, and there was not a moment's interval in crash and fire and rain until after the moon rose at midnight. The great bell of St. Paul's was striking one in the cleared air when Mr. Lorry, escorted by Jerry, high-booted and wearing a lantern, set forth on his return passage to Clerkenwell. There were solitary patches of road on the way between Soho and Clerkenwell, and Mr. Lorry, mindful of footpads, always retained Jerry for this service, though it was usually performed a good 2 hours earlier. "What a night it has been! Almost a night, Jerry," said Mr. Lorry, "to bring the dead out of their graves." "I never see the night myself, master, nor yet I don't expect to. What would do that?" answered Jerry. "Good night, Mr. Carton," said the man of business. "Good night, Mr. Darnay. Shall we ever see such a night again together? Perhaps. Perhaps see the great crowd of people with its rush and roar bearing down upon them too." End of Book 2, Chapter 6, Hundreds of People. Read by Tora in Yellowstone National Park, October 2006.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristen Luoma, greenkri.com. A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Chapter 7. Monseigneur in Town. Monseigneur, one of the great lords in power at the court, held his fortnightly reception in his grand hotel in Paris. Monseigneur was in his inner room, his sanctuary of sanctuaries, the holiest of holies to the crowd of worshippers in the suite of rooms without. Monseigneur was about to take his chocolate. Monseigneur could swallow a great many things with ease, and was by some few sullen minds supposed to be rather rapidly swallowing France. But his morning's chocolate could not so much as get into the throat of Monseigneur without the aid of 4 strong men besides the cook. Yes, it took 4 men, all 4 ablaze with gorgeous decoration, and the chief of them unable to exist with fewer than 2 gold watches in his pocket, emulative of the noble and chaste fashion set by Monseigneur, to conduct the happy chocolate to Monseigneur's lips. One lackey carried the chocolate pot into the sacred presence. A second milled and frothed the chocolate with the little instrument he bore for that function. A third presented the favoured napkin. A fourth, he of the 2 gold watches, poured the chocolate out. It was impossible for Monseigneur to dispense with one of these attendants on the chocolate and hold his high place under the admiring heavens. Deep would have been the blot upon his escutcheon if his chocolate had been ignobly waited on by only 3 men. He must have died of 2. Monseigneur had been out at a little supper last night where the comedy and the grand opera were charmingly represented. Monseigneur was out at a little supper most nights with fascinating company. So polite and so impressible was Monseigneur that the comedy and the grand opera had far more influence with him in the tiresome articles of state affairs and state secrets than the needs of all France. A happy circumstance for France, as the like always is for all countries similarly favoured, always was for England, by way of example, in the regretted days of the Mary Stuart, who sold it. Monseigneur had one truly noble idea of general public business, which was to let everything go on in its own way. Of particular public business, Monseigneur had the other truly noble idea that it must all go his way, tend to his own power and pocket. Of his pleasures, general and particular, Monseigneur had the other truly noble idea, that the world was made for them. The text of his order, altered from the original by only a pronoun which is not much, ran, "The earth and the fullness thereof are mine, saith Monseigneur." Yet Monseigneur had slowly found that vulgar embarrassments crept into his affairs, both private and public. And he had, as to both classes of affairs, allied himself perforce with a farmer-general. As to finances public, because Monseigneur could not make anything at all of them, and must consequently let them out to somebody who could. As to finances private, because farmer-generals were rich, and Monseigneur, after generations of great luxury and expense, was growing poor. Hence, Monseigneur had taken his sister from a convent, while there was yet time to ward off the impending veil, the cheapest garment she could wear, and had bestowed her as a prize upon a very rich farmer-general, poor in family. Which farmer-general, carrying an appropriate cane with a golden apple on the top of it, was now among the company in the outer rooms, much prostrated before by mankind, always excepting superior mankind of the blood of Monseigneur, who, his own wife included, looked down upon him with the loftiest contempt. A sumptuous man was the farmer-general. 30 horses stood in his stables, 24 male domestics sat in his halls, 6 body women waited on his wife. As one who pretended to do nothing but plunder and forage where he could, the farmer-general, howsoever his matrimonial relations conducted to social morality, was at least the greatest reality among the personages who attended the hotel of Monseigneur that day. For the rooms, though a beautiful scene to look at, and adorned with every device of decoration that the taste and skill of the time could achieve, were in truth not a sound business. Considered with any reference to the scarecrows in the rags and nightcaps elsewhere, and not so far off either but that the watching towers of Notre Dame, almost equidistant from the 2 extremes, could see them both, they would have been an exceedingly uncomfortable business, if that could have been anybody's business at the house of Monseigneur. Military officers destitute of military knowledge, naval officers with no idea of a ship, civil officers without a notion of affairs, brazen ecclesiastics of the worst worldly, with sensual eyes, loose tongues, and looser lives, all totally unfit for their several callings, all lying horribly in pretending to belong to them, but all nearly or remotely of the order of Monseigneur, and therefore foisted on all public employments from which anything was to be got. These were to be told off by the score and the score. People not immediately connected with Monseigneur or the state, yet equally unconnected with anything that was real, or with lives passed in travelling by any straight road to any true earthly end, were no less abundant. Doctors who made great fortunes out of dainty remedies for imaginary disorders that never existed, smiled upon their courtly patients in the antechambers of Monseigneur. projectors who had discovered every kind of remedy for the little evils with which the state was touched, except the remedy of setting to work in earnest to root out a single sin, poured their distracting babble into any ears they could lay hold of at the reception of Monseigneur. Unbelieving philosophers who were remodeling the world with words, and making card towers of babble to scale the skies with, talked with unbelieving chemists who had an eye on the transmutation of metals at this wonderful gathering accumulated by Monseigneur. Exquisite gentlemen of the finest breeding, which was at that remarkable time, and has been since, to be known by its fruits of indifference to every natural subject of human interest, were in the most exemplary state of exhaustion at the hotel of Monseigneur. Such homes had these various notabilities left behind them in the fine world of Paris, that the spies among the assembled devotees of Monseigneur, forming a goodly half of the polite company, would have found it hard to discover among the angels of that sphere one solitary wife who in her manners and appearance owned to being a mother. Indeed, except for the mere act of bringing a troublesome creature into this world, which does not go far towards the realization of the name mother, there was no such thing known to the fashion. Peasant women kept the unfashionable babies close and brought them up, and charming grandmammas of 60 dressed and supped as at 20. The leprosy of unreality disfigured every human creature in attendance upon Monseigneur. In the outermost room were half a dozen exceptional people who had had, for a few years, some vague misgiving in them that things in general were going rather wrong. As a promising way of setting them right, half of the half-dozen had become members of a fantastic sect of convulsionists, and were even then considering within themselves whether they should foam, rage, roar, and turn cataleptic on the spot, thereby setting up a highly intelligible finger-post to the future for Monseigneur's guidance. Besides these dervishes were other three who had rushed into another sect, which mended matters with a jargon about the centre of truth, holding that man had got out of the centre of truth, which did not need much demonstration, but had not got out of the circumference, and that he was to be kept from flying out of the circumference, and was even to be shoved back into the centre by fasting and seeing of spirits. Among these, accordingly, much discoursing with spirits went on, and it did a world of good which never became manifest. But the comfort was, that all the company at the Grand Hotel of Monseigneur were perfectly dressed. If the day of judgment had only been ascertained to be a dress day, everybody there would have been eternally correct. Such frizzling and powdering and sticking up of hair, such delicate complexions artificially preserved and mended, such gallant swords to look at, and such delicate honour to the sense of smell, would surely keep anything going for ever and ever. The exquisite gentlemen of the finest breeding wore little pendant trinkets that chinked as they languidly moved. These golden fetters rang like precious little bells, and what with that ringing, and with the rustle of silk and brocade and fine linen, there was a flutter in the air that fanned Saint Antoine and his devouring hunger far away. Dress was the one unfailing talisman and charm used for keeping all things in their places. Everybody was dressed for a fancy ball that was never to leave off. From the palace of the Tuileries, through Monseigneur and the whole court, through the chambers, the tribunals of justice, and all society, except the scarecrows, the fancy ball descended to the common executioner, who, in pursuance of the charm, was required to officiate, frizzled, powdered, in a gold-laced coat, pumps, and white silk stockings. At the gallows and the wheel, the axe was a rarity. Monsieur Paris, as it was the episcopal mode among his brother professors of the provinces, Monsieur Orléans, and the rest to call him, presided in this dainty dress. And who, among the company at Monseigneur's reception in that 1780th year of our Lord, could possibly doubt that a system rooted in a frizzled hangman, powdered, gold-laced, pumped, and white silk stockinged, would see the very stars out? Monseigneur, having eased his 4 men of their burdens and taken his chocolate, caused the doors of the holiest of holiests to be thrown open and issued forth. Then, what submission, what cringing and fawning, what servility, what abject humiliation! As to bowing down in body and spirit, nothing in that way was left for heaven, which may have been one among other reasons why the worshippers of Monseigneur never troubled it. Bestowing a word of promise here and a smile there, a whisper on one happy slave and a wave of the hand on the other, Monseigneur affably passed through his rooms to the remote region of the circumference of truth. There Monseigneur turned and came back again, and so in due course of time got himself shut up in his sanctuary by the chocolate sprites, and was seen no more. The show being over, the flutter in the air became quite a little storm, and the precious little bells went ringing downstairs. There was soon but one person left of all the crowd, and he, with his hat under his arm and his snuff-box in his hand, slowly passed among the mirrors on his way out. "I devote you," said this person, stopping at the last door on his way and turning in the direction of the sanctuary, "to the devil." With that, he shook the snuff from his fingers as if he had shaken the dust from his feet, and quietly walked downstairs. He was a man of about 60, handsomely dressed, haughty in manner, and with a face like a fine mask. A face of a transparent paleness, every feature in it clearly defined, one set expression on it. The nose, beautifully formed otherwise, was very slightly pinched at the top of each nostril. In those two compressions, or dints, the only little change that the face ever showed resided. They persisted in changing colour sometimes, and they would be occasionally dilated and contracted by something like a faint pulsation. Then they gave a look of treachery and cruelty to the whole countenance. Examined with attention, its capacity of helping such a look was to be found in the line of the mouth, and the lines of the orbits of the eyes, being much too horizontal and thin. Still, in the effect of the face made, it was a handsome face, and a remarkable one. Its owner went downstairs into the courtyard, got into his carriage and drove away. Not many people had talked with him at the reception. He had stood in a little space apart, and Monseigneur might have been warmer in his manner. It appeared, under the circumstances, rather agreeable to him to see the common people dispersed before his horses, and often barely escaping from being run down. His man drove as if he were charging an enemy, and the furious recklessness of the man brought no check into the face or to the lips of the master. The complaint had sometimes made itself audible, even in that deaf city and dumb age, that in the narrow streets without footways, the fierce patrician custom of hard driving endangered and maimed the mere vulgar in a barbarous manner. But few cared enough for that to think of it a second time, and in this matter, as in all others, the common wretches were left to get out of their difficulties as they could. With a wild rattle and clatter, and an inhuman abandonment of consideration not easy to be understood in these days, the carriage dashed through the streets and swept round corners, with women screaming before it, and men clutching each other and clutching children out of its way. At last, swooping at a street corner by a fountain, one of its wheels came to a sickening little jolt, and there was a loud cry from a number of voices, and the horses reared and plunged. But for the latter inconvenience, the carriage probably would not have stopped. The carriages were often known to drive on and leave their wounded behind, and why not? But the frightened valet had got down in a hurry, and there were 20 hands at the horses' bridles. "What has gone wrong?" said Monsieur, calmly looking out. A tall man in a nightcap had caught up a bundle from among the feet of the horses, and had lain it on the basement of the fountain, and was down in the mud and wet, howling over it like a wild animal. "Pardon, Monsieur the Marquis," said a ragged and submissive man, "it is a child." "Why does he make that abominable noise? Is it his child?" "Excuse me, Monsieur the Marquis, it is a pity, yes." The fountain was a little removed, for the street opened where it was into a space some 10 or 12 yards square. As the tall man suddenly got up from the ground and came running at the carriage, Monsieur the Marquis clapped his hand for an instant on his sword hilt. "Killed!" shrieked the man in wild desperation, extending both arms at their length above his head and staring at him. "Dead!" The people closed round and looked at Monsieur the Marquis. There was nothing revealed by the many eyes that looked at him but watchfulness and eagerness. There was no visible menacing or anger. Neither did the people say anything. After the first cry they had been silent, and they remained so. The voice of the submissive man who had spoken was flat and tame in its extreme submission. Monsieur the Marquis ran his eyes over them all, as if they had been mere rats come out of their holes. He took out his purse. "It is extraordinary to me," said he, "that you people cannot take care of yourselves and your children. One or the other of you is forever in the way. How do I know what injury you have done to my horses? See, give him that." He threw out a gold coin for the valet to pick up, and all the heads craned forward that all the eyes might look down at it as it fell. The tall man called out again with a most unearthly cry. "Dead!" He was arrested by the quick arrival of another man, for whom the rest made way. On seeing him, the miserable creature fell upon his shoulder, sobbing and crying, and pointing to the fountain where some women were stooping over the motionless bundle and moving gently about it. They were as silent, however, as the men. I know all," said the last comer. "Be a brave man, my Gaspard. It is better for the poor little plaything to die so than to live. It has died in a moment without pain. Could it have lived an hour as happily?" "You are a philosopher, you there," said the Marquis, smiling. "How do they call you?" "They call me Defarge." "Of what trade?" "Monsieur the Marquis, vendor of wine." "Pick up that, philosopher and vendor of wine," said the Marquis, throwing him another gold coin, "and spend it as you will. The horses there, are they right?" Without deigning to look at the assemblage a second time, Monsieur the Marquis leaned back in his seat, and was just being driven away with the air of a gentleman who had accidentally broke some common thing and had paid for it, and could afford to pay for it, when his ease was suddenly disturbed by a coin flying into his carriage and ringing on its floor. "Hold!" said Monsieur the Marquis. "Hold the horses! Who threw that?" He looked to the spot where Defarge, the vendor of wine, had stood a moment before. But the wretched father was grovelling on his face on the pavement in that spot, and the figure that stood beside him was the figure of a dark, stout woman knitting. "You dogs!" said the Marquis, but smoothly, with an unchanged front, except as to the spots on his nose. "I would ride over any of you very willingly, and exterminate you from the earth, if I knew which rascal threw at the carriage, and if that brigand were sufficiently near it, he should be crushed under the wheels." So cowed was their condition, and so long and hard their experience of what such a man could do to them, within the law and beyond it, that not a voice or a hand or even an eye was raised. Among the men, not one. But the woman who stood knitting looked up steadily, and looked the Marquis in the face. It was not for his dignity to notice it. His contemptuous eyes passed over her, and over all the other rats, and he leaned back in his seat again, and gave the word. "Go on." He was driven on, and other carriages came whirling by in quick succession. The minister, the state projector, the farmer general, the doctor, the lawyer, the ecclesiastic, the grand opera, the comedy, the whole fancy ball in a bright, continuous flow came whirling by. The rats had crept out of their holes to look on, and they remained looking on for hours. Soldiers and police often passing between them and the spectacle, and making a barrier behind which they slunk and through which they peeped. The father had long ago taken up his bundle and bidden himself away with it, when the woman who had tended the bundle while it lay on the base of the fountain sat there watching the running of the water and the rolling of the fancy ball. When the one woman who had stood conspicuous, knitting, still knitted on with the steadfastness of fate. The water of the fountain ran, the swift river ran. The day ran into evening. So much life in the city ran into death according to rule. Time and tide waited for no man. The rats were sleeping close together in their dark holes again. The fancy ball was lighted up at supper. All things ran their course. End of Chapter 7. Monseigneur in Town.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Chip in Tampa, Florida, on January 18th, 2006. A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Book the Second, Chapter 8. Monseigneur in the Country. A beautiful landscape, with the corn bright in it, but not abundant. Patches of poor rye where corn should have been, patches of poor peas and beans, patches of most coarse vegetable substitutes for wheat. On inanimate nature, as on the men and women who cultivated it, a prevalent tendency toward an appearance of vegetating unwillingly, a dejected disposition to give up and wither away. Monsieur le Marquis in his touring carriage, which might have been lighter, conducted by 4 post-horses and 2 postilions, fagged up a steep hill. A blush on the countenance of Monsieur le Marquis was no impeachment of his high breeding. It was not from within. It was occasioned by an external circumstance beyond his control, the setting sun. The sunset struck so brilliantly into the travelling carriage when it gained the hilltop that its occupant was steeped in crimson. "It will die out," said Monsieur le Marquis, glancing at his hands. "Directly." In effect, the sun was so low that it dipped at the moment. When the heavy drag had been adjusted to the wheel, and the carriage slid downhill with a cinderous smell in a cloud of dust, the red glow departed quickly. The sun and the Marquis going down together, there was no glow left when the drag was taken off. But there remained a broken country, bold and open, a little village at the bottom of the hill, a broad sweep and rise beyond it, a church tower, a windmill, a forest for the chase, and a crag with a fortress on it, used as a prison. Round upon all these darkening objects, as the night drew on, the Marquis looked with an air of one who was coming near home. The village had its one poor street, with its poor brewery, poor tannery, poor tavern, poor stable-yard for relays of post-horses, poor fountain, all the usual poor appointments. It had its poor people, too. All its people were poor, and many of them were sitting at their doors, shredding spare onions and the like for supper, while many were at the fountain, washing leaves and grasses and any small yieldings of the earth that could be eaten. Excessive sips of what made them poor were not wanting. The tax for the state, the tax for the church, the tax for the lord, tax local and tax general were to be paid here and to be paid there according to solemn inscription in the little village, until the wonder was that there was any village left unswallowed. Few children were to be seen, and no dogs. As to the men and women, their choice on earth was stated in the prospect: life on the lowest terms that could sustain it down in the little village under the mill, or captivity and death in the dominant prison on the crag. Heralded by a courier in advance, and by the cracking of his postilions' whips, each twined snake-like about their heads in the evening air, as if he came attended by the Furies, Monsieur le Marquis drew up his travelling carriage at the posting-house gate. It was hard by the fountain, and the peasants suspended their operations to look at him. He looked at them, and saw in them, without knowing it, the slow, sure filing down of misery-worn face and figure, that was to make the meagreness of Frenchmen an English superstition which would survive the truth through the best part of 100 years. Monsieur le Marquis cast his eyes over the submissive faces that drooped before him, as the like of himself had drooped before the Monseigneur of the court. The only difference was that these faces drooped merely to suffer and not to propitiate, when a grizzled mender of the roads joined the group. "Bring me hither that fellow," said the Marquis to the courier. The fellow was brought, cap in hand, and the other fellows closed round to look and listen, in the manner of the people at the Paris fountain. "I passed you on the road?" "Monseigneur, it is true. I had the honor of being passed on the road." "Coming up the hill, and at the top of the hill, both?" "Monseigneur, it is true." "What did you look at so fixedly?" "Monseigneur, I looked at the man." He stooped a little, and with his tattered blue cap pointed under the carriage. All his fellows stooped to look under the carriage. "What man, pig? And why look there?" "Pardon, Monseigneur. He swung by the chain of the shoe, the drag." "Who?" demanded the traveller. "Monseigneur, the man." "May the devil carry away these idiots! How do you call the man? You know all the men in this part of the country. Who was he?" "Your clemency, Monseigneur. He was not a part of the country. Of all the days of the life, I never saw him." "Swinging by the chain? To be suffocated?" "With your gracious permission, that was the wonder of it, Monseigneur. His head hanging over, like this." He turned himself sideways to the carriage and leaned back with his face thrown up to the sky and his head hanging down, then recovered himself, fumbled with his cap, and made a bow. "What was he like?" "Monseigneur, he was whiter than the miller, all covered with dust, white as a spectre, tall as a spectre." The picture produced an immense sensation in the crowd, but all eyes, without comparing notes with other eyes, looked at Monsieur le Marquis, perhaps to observe whether he had any spectre on his conscience. "Truly you did well," said the Marquis, felicitously sensible that such vermin were not to ruffle him, "to see a thief accompanying my carriage, and to not open that great mouth of yours. Bah! Put him aside, Monsieur Gabelle." Monsieur Gabelle was the postmaster, and some other taxing functionary united. He had come out with great obsequiousness to assist at this examination, and had held the examined by the drapery of his arm in an official manner. "Bah! Go aside," said Monsieur Gabelle. "Lay hands on this stranger if he seeks to lodge in your village tonight, and be sure that his business is honest, Gabelle." "Monseigneur, I am flattered to devote myself to your orders." "Did he run away, fellow? Where is that accursed?" The accursed was already under the carriage with some half-dozen particular friends, pointing out the chain with his blue cap. Some half-dozen other particular friends promptly hauled him out, and presented him, breathless, to Monsieur le Marquis. "Did the man run away, dolt, when he stopped for the drag?" "Monseigneur, he precipitated himself over the hillside, head first, as a person plunges into the river." "See to it, Gabelle. Go on." The half-dozen who were peering at the chain were still among the wheels, like sheep. The wheels turned so suddenly that they were lucky to save their skins and bones. They had very little else to save, or they might not have been so fortunate. The burst with which the carriage started out of the village and up the rise beyond was soon checked by the steepness of the hill. Gradually it subsided to a foot-pace, swinging and lumbering upward among the many sweet scents of a summer night. The postilions, with 1,000 gossamer gnats circling about them in lieu of the furies, quietly mended the points to the lashes of their whips. The valet walked by the horses. The courier was audible, trotting on ahead into the dun distance. At the steepest point of the hill there was a little burial ground with a cross and a new large figure of our Saviour on it. It was but a poor figure in wood, done by some inexperienced rustic carver, but he had studied the figure in the life, maybe his own life, perhaps, for it was dreadfully spare and thin. To this distressful emblem of a great distress that had long been growing worse, and was not at its worst, a woman was kneeling. She turned her head as the carriage came up to her, rose quickly, and presented herself at the carriage door. "It is you, Monseigneur! Monseigneur, a petition!" With an exclamation of impatience, but with his unchangeable face, Monseigneur looked out. "How then? What is it? Always petitions." "Monseigneur, for the love of the great God, my husband, the forester." "What of your husband, the forester? Always the same with you people. He cannot pay something?" "He has paid all, Monseigneur. He is dead." "Well, he is quiet. Can I restore him to you?" "Alas, no, Monseigneur, but he lies yonder under a little heap of poor grass." "Well?" "Monseigneur, are there so many little heaps of poor grass?" "Again, well?" She looked an old woman, but was young. Her manner was one of passionate grief. By turns she clasped her veinous and knotted hands together with wild energy, and laid one of them on the carriage door, tenderly, caressingly, as if it had been a human breast, and could be expected to feel the appealing touch. "Monseigneur, hear me! Monseigneur, hear my petition! My husband died of want. So many die of want. So many more will die of want." "Again, well, can I feed them?" "Monseigneur, the good God knows, but I don't ask it. My petition is that a morsel of stone or wood with my husband's name may be placed over him to show where he lies. Otherwise the place will be quickly forgotten, and it will never be found when I am dead of the same malady. Shall I be laid under some other heap of poor grass, Monseigneur? There are so many. They increase so fast. There is so much want. Monseigneur! Monseigneur!" The valet had put her away from the door. The carriage had broken into a brisk trot. The postilions had quickened the pace, and she was left far behind. And Monseigneur, again escorted by the furies, was rapidly diminishing the league or two of distance that remained between him and his chateau. The sweet scents of the summer night rose all around him, and rose as the rain falls impartially on the dusty, ragged, and toil-worn group at the fountain not far away, to whom the meander of roads, with the aid of the blue cap without which he was nothing, still enlarged upon his man like a spectre, as long as they could bear it. By degrees, as they could bear no more, they dropped off one by one, and lights twinkled in little casements, which lights, as the casements darkened and more stars came out, seemed to have shot up into the sky, instead of having been extinguished. The shadow of a high-roofed house and many overhanging trees was upon Monsieur le Marquis by that time, and the shadow was exchanged for the light of a flambeau, as his carriage stopped and the great door to his chateau was opened to him. "Monsieur Charles, whom I expect, has he arrived from England?" "Monseigneur, not yet." So ends Book 2, Chapter 8.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information and to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nocturna. A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Book 2, Chapter 9. The Gorgon's Head. It was a heavy mass of building, that chateau of Monsieur the Marquis, with a large stone courtyard before it, and 2 stone sweeps of staircase meeting in a stone terrace before the principal door. A stony business altogether, with heavy stone balustrades and stone urns and stone flowers, and stone faces of men and stone heads of lions in all directions, as if the Gorgon's head had surveyed it when it was finished 2 centuries ago. Up the broad flight of shallow steps, Monsieur the Marquis, flambeau proceeded, went from his carriage, sufficiently disturbing the darkness to elicit loud remonstrance from an owl in the roof of the great pile of stable building away among the trees. All else was so quiet that the flambeau carried up the steps, and the other flambeau held at the great door, burnt as if they were in a close room of state, instead of being in the open night air. Other sound than the owl's voice there was none, save the failing of a fountain into its stone basin, for it was one of those dark nights that hold their breath by the hour together, and then heave a long, low sigh, and then hold their breath again. The great door clanged behind him, and Monsieur the Marquis crossed a hall, grim with certain old boar-spears, swords, and knives of the chase, grimmer with certain heavy riding-rods and riding-whips, of which many a peasant, gone to his benefactor Death, had felt the weight when his lord was angry. Avoiding the larger rooms, which were dark and made fast for the night, Monsieur the Marquis, with his flambeau bearer going on before, went up the staircase to a door in a corridor. This, thrown open, admitted him to his own private apartment of 3 rooms, his bedchamber and 2 others. High vaulted rooms with cool uncarpeted floors, great dogs upon the hearths for the burning of wood in winter-time, and all luxuries befitting the state of a marquis, in a luxurious age and country. The fashion of the last Louis but one, of the line that was never to break, the 14th Louis, was conspicuous in their rich furniture, but it was diversified by many objects that were illustrations of old pages in the history of France. A supper table was laid for 2, in the 3rd of the rooms, a round room, in one of the chateau's 4 extinguisher-topped towers. A small lofty room, with its window wide open, and the wooden jalousie blinds closed, so that the dark night only showed in slight horizontal lines of black, alternating with their broad lines of stone color. "My nephew," said the Marquis, glancing at the supper preparation. "They said he was not arrived." Nor was he, but he had been expected with Monseigneur. "Ah, it is not probable he will arrive tonight. Nevertheless, leave the table as it is. I shall be ready in a quarter of an hour." In a quarter of an hour, Monseigneur was ready, and sat down alone to his sumptuous and choice supper. His chair was opposite to the window, and he had taken his soup, and was raising his glass of Bordeaux to his lips, when he put it down. "What is that?" he calmly asked, looking with attention at the horizontal lines of black and stone color. "Monseigneur, that? Outside the blinds. Open the blinds." It was done. "Well?" "Monseigneur, it is nothing. The trees and the night are all that are here." The servant who spoke had thrown the blinds wide, had looked out into the vacant darkness, and stood with that blank behind him, looking round for instructions. "Good," said the imperturbable master. "Close them again." That was done too, and the Marquis went on with his supper. He was halfway through it when he again stopped with his glass in his hand, hearing the sound of wheels. It came on briskly, and came up to the front of the chateau. "Ask who has arrived." It was the nephew of Monseigneur. He had been some few leagues behind Monseigneur early in the afternoon. He had diminished the distance rapidly, but not so rapidly as to come up with Monseigneur on the road. He had heard of Monseigneur at the posting-houses as being before him. He was to be told, said Monseigneur, that supper waited him then and there, and that he was prayed to come to it. In a little while he came. He had been known in England as Charles Darnay. Monseigneur received him in a courtly manner, but they did not shake hands. "You left Paris yesterday, sir," he said to Monseigneur as he took his seat at the table. "Yesterday. And you?" "I come direct." "From London?" "Yes." "You have been a long time coming," said the Marquis with a smile. "On the contrary, I come direct." "Pardon me, I mean not a long time on the journey, a long time intending the journey." "I have been detained by—" The nephew stopped a moment in his answer. "Various business." "Without doubt," said the polished uncle. So long as a servant was present, no other words passed between them. When coffee had been served and they were alone together, the nephew, looking at the uncle and meeting the eyes of the face that was like a fine mask, opened a conversation. "I have come back, sir, as you anticipate, pursuing the object that took me away. It carried me into great and unexpected peril, but it is a sacred object, and if it had carried me to death, I hope it would have sustained me." "Not to death," said the uncle. "It is not necessary to say to death." "I doubt, sir," returned the nephew, "whether if it had carried me to the utmost brink of death, you would have cared to stop me there." The deepened marks in the nose, and the lengthening of the fine straight lines in the cruel face, looked ominous as to that. The uncle made a graceful gesture of protest, which was so clearly a slight form of good breeding that it was not reassuring. "Indeed, sir," pursued the nephew, "for anything I know, you may have expressly worked to give a more suspicious appearance to the suspicious circumstances that surrounded me." "No, no, no," said the uncle pleasantly. "But however that may be," resumed the nephew, glancing at him with deep distrust, "I know that your diplomacy would stop me by any means and would know no scruple as to means." "My friend, I told you so," said the uncle, with a fine pulsation in the two marks. "Do me the favor to recall that I told you so, long ago." "I recall it." "Thank you," said the Marquis, very sweetly indeed. His tone lingered in the air, almost like the tone of a musical instrument. "In effect, sir," pursued the nephew, "I believe it to be at once your bad fortune and my good fortune that has kept me out of a prison in France here." "I do not quite understand," returned the uncle, sipping his coffee. "Dare I ask you to explain?" "I believe that if you were not in disgrace with the court, and had not been overshadowed by that cloud for years past, a letter de cachet would have sent me to some fortress indefinitely." "It is possible," said the uncle, with great calmness. "For the honor of the family, I could even resolve to incommode you to that extent. Pray excuse me." "I perceive that, happily for me, the reception of the day before yesterday was, as usual, a cold one," observed the nephew. "I would not say happily, my friend," returned the uncle, with refined politeness. "I would not be sure of that. A good opportunity for consideration, surrounded by the advantages of solitude, might influence your destiny to far greater advantage than you influence it for yourself. But it is useless to discuss the question. I am, as you say, at a disadvantage. These little instruments of correction, these gentle aids to the power and honor of families, these slight favors that might so incommode you, are only to be obtained now by interest and importunity. They are sought by so many, and they are granted, comparatively, to so few. It used not to be so, but France in all such things is changed for the worse. Our not remote ancestors held the right of life and death over the surrounding vulgar. From this room many such dogs have been taken out to be hanged. In the next room, my bedroom, one fellow, to our knowledge, was poignarded on the spot for professing some insolent delicacy respecting his daughter. His daughter. We have lost many privileges. A new philosophy has become the mode. And the assertion of our station in these days might, I do not go so far as to say would, but might, cause us real inconvenience, all very bad, very bad. The Marquis took a gentle little pinch of snuff, and shook his head, as elegantly despondent as he could becomingly be of a country still containing himself, that great means of regeneration. We have so asserted our station, both in the old time and in the modern time also, said the nephew gloomily, that I believe our name to be more detested than any name in France. Let us hope so, said the uncle. Detestation of the high is the involuntary homage of the low. There is not, pursued the nephew, in his former tone, a face I can look at in all this country round about us, which looks at me with any deference on it, but the dark deference of fear and slavery. A compliment, said the Marquis, to the grandeur of the family, merited by the manner in which the family has sustained its grandeur. Ha! And he took another gentle pinch of snuff and lightly crossed his legs. But when his nephew, leaning an elbow on the table, covered his eyes thoughtfully and dejectedly with his hand, the fine mask looked at him sideways, with a stronger concentration of keenness, closeness, and dislike, that was comportable with its wearer's assumption of indifference. Repression is the only lasting philosophy. The dark deference of fear and slavery, my friend, observed the Marquis, will keep the dogs obedient to the whip, as long as this roof, looking up to it, shuts out the sky. That might not be so long as the Marquis supposed. If a picture of the chateau as it was to be a very few years hence, and of 50 like it, as they too were to be a very few years hence, could have been shown to him that night, he might have been at a loss to claim his own from the ghastly fire-charred plunder-wrecked rains. As for the roof he vaunted, he might have found that, shutting out the sky in a new way, to wit, forever, from the eyes of the bodies into which its lead was fired out of the barrels of 100,000 muskets. Meanwhile, said the Marquis, I will preserve the honour and repose of the family, if you will not. But you must be fatigued. Shall we terminate our conference for the night? A moment more. An hour, if you please. Sir, said the nephew, we have done wrong, and are reaping the fruits of wrong. We have done wrong? Repeated the Marquis, with an inquiring smile, and delicately pointing first to his nephew, then to himself. Our family, our honourable family, whose honour is of so much account to both of us in such different ways. Even in my father's time we did a world of wrong, injuring every human creature who came between us and our pleasure, whatever it was. Why need I speak of my father's time, when it is equally yours? Can I separate my father's twin brother, joint inheritor and next successor, from himself? Death has done that, said the Marquis. And has left me, answered the nephew, bound to a system that is frightful to me, responsible for it, but powerless in it, seeking to execute the last request of my dear mother's lips, and obey the last look of my dear mother's eyes, which implored me to have mercy and to redress, and tortured by seeking assistance and power in vain. Seeking them from me, my nephew, said the Marquis, touching him on the breast with his forefinger. They were now standing by the hearth. You will forever seek them in vain, be assured. Every fine straight line in the clear whiteness of his face was cruelly, craftily, and closely compressed, while he stood looking quietly at his nephew, with his snuff-box in his hand. Once again he touched him on the breast, as though his finger were the fine point of a small sword, with which in delicate finesse he ran him through the body and said, "My friend, I will die perpetuating the system under which I have lived." When he had said it, he took a culminating pinch of snuff and put his box in his pocket. "Better to be a rational creature," he added then, after ringing a small bell on the table, "and accept your natural destiny. But you are lost, Monsieur Charles, I see." "This property and France are lost to me," said the nephew sadly. "I renounce them." "Are they both yours to renounce? France may be, but is the property?" "It is scarcely worth mentioning, but is it yet?" "I had no intention, in the words I used, to claim it yet. If it passed to me from you tomorrow, which I have the vanity to hope is not probable, or 20 years hence—" "You do me too much honor," said the Marquis. "Still, I prefer that supposition." "I would abandon it and live otherwise and elsewhere. It is little to relinquish. What is it but a wilderness of misery and ruin?" "Ha!" said the Marquis, glancing round the luxurious room. "To the eye it is fair enough here, but seen in its integrity under the sky and by daylight, it is a crumbling tower of waste, mismanagement, extortion, debt, mortgage, oppression, hunger, nakedness, and suffering." "Ha!" said the Marquis again, in a well-satisfied manner. "If it ever becomes mine, it shall be put into some hands better qualified to free it slowly, if such a thing is possible, from the weight that drags it down, so that the miserable people who cannot leave it, and who have been long wrung to the last point of endurance, may in another generation suffer less. But it is not for me. There is a curse on it and on all this land." "And you?" said the uncle. "Forgive my curiosity. Do you, under your new philosophy, graciously intend to live?" "I must do, to live, what others of my countrymen, even with nobility at their backs, may have to do some day work." "In England, for example?" "Yes. The family honor, sir, is safe from me in this country. The family name can suffer from me in no other, for I bear it in no other." The ringing of the bell had caused the adjoining bedchamber to be lighted. It now shone brightly through the door of communication. The Marquis looked that way and listened for the retreating step of his valet. "England is very attractive to you, seeing how indifferently you have prospered there," he observed then, turning his calm face to his nephew with a smile. "I have already said that for my prospering there I am sensible. I may be indebted to you, sir. For the rest, it is my refuge. They say, those boastful English, that it is the refuge of many. You know a compatriot who has found a refuge there, a doctor?" "Yes." "With a daughter?" "Yes." "Yes," said the Marquis. "You are fatigued. Good night." As he bent his head in his most courtly manner, there was a secrecy in his smiling face, and he conveyed an air of mystery to those words, which struck the eyes and ears of his nephew forcibly. At the same time, the thin, straight lines of the setting of the eyes, and the thin, straight lips, and the markings in the nose curved with a sarcasm that looked handsomely diabolic. "Yes," repeated the Marquis, "a doctor with a daughter. Yes. So commences the new philosophy. You are fatigued. Good night." It would have been of as much avail to interrogate any stone face outside the chateau as to interrogate that face of his. The nephew looked at him in vain in passing on to the door. "Good night," said the uncle. "I look to the pleasure of seeing you again in the morning. Good repose." "Light monsieur my nephew to his chamber there, and burn monsieur my nephew in his bed, if you will," he added to himself, before he rang his little bell again, and summoned his valet to his own bedroom. The valet come and gone, Monsieur the Marquis walked to and fro in his loose chamber robe to prepare himself gently for sleep, that hot still night. Rustling about the room, his softly slippered feet making no noise on the floor, he moved like a refined tiger, looked like some enchanted marquis of the impenitently wicked sort, in story, whose periodical change into tiger form was either just going off or just coming on. He moved from end to end of his voluptuous bedroom, looking again at the scraps of the day's journey that came unbidden into his mind, the slow toil up the hill at sunset, the setting sun, the descent, the mill, the prison on the crag, the little village in the hollow, the peasants at the fountain, and the mender of roads with his blue cap pointing out the chain under the carriage. That fountain suggested the Paris fountain, and the little bundle lying on the step, the woman bending over it, and the tall man with his arms up crying, "Dead!" "I am cool now," said Monsieur the Marquis, "and may go to bed." So, leaving only one light burning on the large hearth, he let his thin gauze curtains fall around him, and heard the night break its silence with a long sigh as he composed himself to sleep. The stone faces on the outer walls stared blindly at the black night for 3 heavy hours. For 3 heavy hours the horses in the stables rattled at their racks, the dogs barked, and the owl made a noise with very little resemblance in it to the noise conventionally assigned to the owl by men poets. But it is the obstinate custom of such creatures hardly ever to say what is set down for them. For 3 heavy hours the stone faces of the chateau, lion and human, stared blindly at the night. Dead darkness lay on all the landscape. Dead darkness added its own hush to the hushing dust on all the roads. The burial place had got to the pass that its little heaps of poor grass were undistinguishable from one another. The figure on the cross might have come down, for anything that could be seen of it. In the village, taxers and taxed were fast asleep, dreaming perhaps of banquets, as the starved usually do, and of ease and rest, as the driven slave and the yoked ox may. Its lean inhabitants slept soundly and were fed and freed. The fountain in the village flowed unseen and unheard, and the fountain at the chateau dropped unseen and unheard, both melting away like the minutes that were falling from the spring of time, through 3 dark hours. Then the grey water of both began to be ghostly in the light, and the eyes of the stone faces of the chateau were opened. Lighter and lighter, until at last the sun touched the tops of the still trees, and poured its radiance over the hill. In the glow, the water of the chateau fountain seemed to turn to blood, and the stone faces crimsoned. The carol of the birds was loud and high, and on the weather-beaten sill of the great window of the bedchamber of Monsieur the Marquis, one little bird sang its sweetest song with all its might. At this, the nearest stone face seemed to stare amazed, and with open mouth and dropped under jaw, looked awe-stricken. Now the sun was full up, and movement began in the village. Casement windows opened, crazy doors were unbarred, and people came forth shivering, chilled as yet by the new sweet air. Then began the rarely lighted toil of the day among the village population. Some to the fountain, some to the fields. Men and women here, to dig and delve, men and women there, to see to the poor livestock, and lead the bony cows out, to such pasture as could be found by the roadside. In the church and at the cross, a kneeling figure or two, attendant on the latter prayers, the led cow trying for a breakfast among the weeds at its foot. The chateau awoke later, as became its quality, but awoke gradually and surely. First the lonely boar spears and knives of the chase had been reddened as of old, then had gleamed trenchant in the morning sunshine. Now doors and windows were thrown open, horses in their stables looked round over their shoulders at the light and freshness pouring in at doorways, leaves sparkled and rustled at iron-grated windows, dogs pulled hard at their chains and reared impatient to be loosed. All these trivial incidents belonged to the routine of life and the return of morning. Surely not so the ringing of the great bell of the chateau, nor the running up and down the stairs, nor the hurried figures on the terrace, nor the booting and tramping here and there and everywhere, nor the quick saddling of horses and riding away. What winds conveyed this hurry to the grizzled mender of roads, already at work on the hilltop beyond the village, with his day's dinner, not too much to carry, lying in a bundle that it was worth no crow's while to peck at, on a heap of stones. Had the birds, carrying some grains of it to a distance, dropped one over him as they sow chance seeds? Whether or no, the mender of roads ran on the sultry morning, as if for his life, down the hill, knee-high in dust, and never stopped till he got to the fountain. All the people of the village were at the fountain, standing about in their depressed manner, and whispering low, but showing no other emotions than grim curiosity and surprise. The led cows, hastily brought in and tethered to anything that would hold them, were looking stupidly on, or lying down chewing the cud of nothing particularly, repaying their trouble, which they had picked up in their interrupted saunter. Some of the people of the chateau, and some of those of the posting-house, and all the taxing authorities, were armed, more or less, and were crowded on the other side of the little street in a purposeless way that was highly fraught with nothing. Already the mender of roads had penetrated into the midst of a group of 50 particular friends, and was smiting himself in the breast with his blue cap. What did all this portend? And what portended the swift hoisting up of Monsieur Gabelle behind a servant on horseback, and the conveying away of the said Gabelle, double laden though the horse was, at a gallop, like a new version of the German ballad of Lenora? It portended that there was one face too many up at the chateau. The Gorgon had surveyed the building again in the night, and had added one stone face wanting, the stone face for which it had waited through about 200 years. It lay back on the pillow of Monsieur the Marquis. It was like a fine mask, suddenly startled, made angry and petrified. Driven home into the heart of the stone figure attached to it was a knife. Round its hilt was a frill of paper, on which was scrawled, "Drive him fast to his tomb. This from Jacques." End of Book 2, Chapter 9.
This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susan Denny, Denton, Texas. A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, Book 2, Chapter 10. 2 Promises. More months, to the number of 12, had come and gone, and Mr. Charles Darnay was established in England as a higher teacher of the French language who was conversant with French literature. In this age he would have been a professor. In that age he was a tutor. He read with young men who could find any leisure and interest for the study of a living tongue spoken all over the world, and he cultivated a taste for its stores of knowledge and fancy. He could write of them, besides, in sound English, and render them into sound English. Such masters were not at that time easily found. Princes that had been, and kings that were to be, were not yet of the teacher class, and no ruined nobility had dropped out of Tellson's ledgers to turn cooks and carpenters. As a tutor, whose attainments made the student's way unusually pleasant and profitable, and as an elegant translator who brought something to his work besides mere dictionary knowledge, young Mr. Darnay soon became known and encouraged. He was well acquainted, moreover, with the circumstances of his country, and those were of ever-growing interest. So with great perseverance and untiring industry he prospered. In London he had expected neither to walk on pavements of gold nor to lie on beds of roses. If he had had any such exalted expectation, he would not have prospered. He had expected labor, and he found it, and did it, and made the best of it. In this his prosperity consisted. A certain portion of his time was passed at Cambridge,
where he read with undergraduates as a sort of tolerated smuggler who drove a contraband trade in European languages, instead of conveying Greek and Latin through the custom house. The rest of his time he passed in London. Now from the days when it was always summer in Eden to these days when it is mostly winter in fallen latitudes, the world of a man has invariably gone one way, Charles Darnay's way, the way of the love of a woman. He had loved Lucie Manette from the hour of his danger. He had never heard a sound so sweet and dear as the sound of her compassionate voice. He had never seen a face so tenderly beautiful as hers when it was confronted with his own on the edge of the grave that had been dug for him. But he had not yet spoken to her on the subject. The assassination at the deserted chateau far away beyond the heaving water and the long, long, dusty roads, the solid stone chateau which had itself become the mere mist of a dream, had been done a year, and he had never yet, by so much as a single spoken word, disclosed to her the state of his heart. That he had reasons for this he knew full well. It was again a summer day when, lately arrived in London from his college occupation, he turned into the quiet corner in Soho, bent on seeking an opportunity of opening his mind to Dr. Manette. It was the close of the summer day, and he knew Lucie to be out with Miss Pross. He found the doctor reading in his armchair at a window. The energy which had at once supported him under his old sufferings and aggravated their sharpness had been gradually restored to him. He was now a very energetic man indeed, with great firmness of purpose, strength of resolution, and vigor of action. In his recovered energy he was sometimes a little fitful and sudden, as he had at first been in the exercise of his other recovered faculties, but this had never been frequently observable, and had grown more and more rare. He studied much, slept little, sustained a great deal of fatigue with ease, and was equably cheerful. To him now entered Charles Darnay, at sight of whom he laid aside his book and held out his hand. "Charles Darnay, I rejoice to see you. We have been counting on your return these 3 or 4 days past. Mr. Stryver and Sydney Carton were both here yesterday, and both made you out to be more than due." "I am obliged to them for their interest in the matter," he answered, a little coldly as to them, though very warmly as to the doctor. "Miss Manette?" "Is well," said the doctor, as he stopped short, "and your return will delight us all. She has gone out on some household matters, but will soon be home." "Dr. Manette, I knew she was from home. I took the opportunity of her being from home to beg to speak to you." There was a blank silence. "Yes," said the doctor with evident constraint. "Bring your chair here, and speak on." He complied as to the chair, but appeared to find the speaking on less easy. "I have had the happiness, Dr. Manette, of being so intimate here," so he at length began, "for some year and a half, that I hope the topic on which I am about to touch may not—" He was stayed by the doctor's putting out his hand to stop him. When he had kept it so a little while, he said, drawing it back, "Is Lucie the topic?" "She is." "It is hard for me to speak of her at any time. It is very hard for me to hear her spoken of in that tone of yours, Charles Darnay." "It is a tone of fervent admiration, true homage, and deep love, Dr. Manette," he said deferentially. There was another blank silence before her father rejoined, "I believe it. I do you justice. I believe it." His constraint was so manifest, and it was so manifest, too, that it originated in an unwillingness to approach the subject, that Charles Darnay hesitated. "Shall I go on, sir?" Another blank. "Yes, Go on. You anticipate what I would say, though you cannot know how earnestly I say it, how earnestly I feel it, without knowing my secret heart, and the hopes and fears and anxieties with which it has long been laden. Dear Dr. Manette, I love your daughter fondly, dearly, disinterestedly, devotedly. If ever there were love in the world, I love her. You have loved yourself. Let your old love speak for me." The doctor sat with his face turned away, and his eyes bent on the ground. At the last words, he stretched out his hand again hurriedly and cried, "Not that, sir! Let that be! I adjure you, do not recall that!" His cry was so like a cry of actual pain that it rang in Charles Darnay's ears long after he had ceased. He motioned with the hand he had extended, and it seemed to be an appeal to Darnay to pause. The latter so received it, and remained silent. "I ask your pardon," said the doctor in a subdued tone, after some moments. "I do not doubt your loving Lucie. You may be satisfied of it." He turned toward him in his chair, but did not look at him or raise his eyes. His chin dropped upon his hand, and his white hair overshadowed his face. "Have you spoken to Lucie?" "No." "Nor written?" "Never." It would be ungenerous to affect not to know that your self-denial is to be referred to your consideration for her father. Her father thanks you." He offered his hand, but his eyes did not go with it. "I know," said Darnay respectfully. "How can I fail to know, Dr. Manette, I who have seen you together from day to day, that between you and Miss Manette there is an affection so unusual, so touching, so belonging to the circumstances in which it has been nurtured, that it can have few parallels, even in the tenderness between a father and child. I know, Dr. Manette, how can I fail to know, that mingled with the affection and duty of a daughter who has become a woman, there is in her heart towards you all the love and reliance of infancy itself. I know that, as in her childhood she had no parent, so she is now devoted to you with all the constancy and fervour of her present years and character, united to the trustfulness and attachment of the early days in which you were lost to her. I know perfectly well that if you had been restored to her from the world beyond this life, you could hardly be invested in her sight with a more sacred character than that in which you are always with her. I know that when she is clinging to you, the hands of baby, girl, and woman, all in one, are round your neck. I know that in loving you she sees and loves her mother at her own age, sees and loves you at my age, loves her mother broken-hearted, loves you through your dreadful trial and in your blessed restoration. I have known this night and day since I have known you in your home." Her father sat silent, with his face bent down. His breathing was a little quickened, but he repressed all other signs of agitation. Dear Dr. Manette, always knowing this, always seeing her and you with this hallowed light about you, I have forborne and forborne as long as it was in the nature of man to do it. I have felt, and do even now feel, that to bring my love, even mine, between you, is to touch your history with something not quite so good as itself. But I love her. Heaven is my witness that I love her." "I believe it," answered her father mournfully. "I have thought so before now. I believe it." "But do not believe," said Darnay, upon whose ear the mournful voice struck with a reproachful sound, "that if my fortune were so cast as that, being one day so happy as to make her my wife, I must at any time put any separation between her and you, I could or would breathe a word of what I now say. Besides that, I should know it to be hopeless. I should know it to be a baseness. If I had any such possibility, even at a remote distance of years, harboured in my thoughts and hidden in my heart, if it ever had been there, if it ever could be there, I could not now touch this honoured hand." He laid his own upon it as he spoke. "No, dear Dr. Manette, like you, a voluntary exile from France. Like you, driven from it by its distractions, oppressions, and miseries. Like you, striving to live away from it by my own exertions and trusting in a happier future, I look only to sharing your fortunes, sharing your life and home, and being faithful to you to the death. Not to divide with Lucie her privilege as your child, companion, and friend, but to come in aid of it and bind her closer to you, if such a thing can be." His touch still lingered on her father's hand. Answering the touch for a moment, but not coldly, her father rested his hands upon the arms of his chair and looked up for the first time since the beginning of the conference. A struggle was evidently in his face, a struggle with that occasional look which had a tendency in it to dark doubt and dread. "You speak so feelingly and so manfully, Charles Darnay, that I thank you with all my heart, and will open all my heart, or nearly so. Have you any reason to believe that Lucie loves you?" "None. As yet, none." "Is it the immediate object of this confidence that you may at once ascertain that with my knowledge?" "Not even so. I might not have the hopefulness to do it for weeks. I might, mistaken or not mistaken, have that hopefulness to-morrow." "Do you seek any guidance from me?" "I ask none, sir, but I have thought it possible that you might have it in your power, if you should deem it right, to give me some." "Do you seek any promise from me?" "I do seek that." "What is it?" "I well understand that without you I could have no hope. I well understand that even if Miss Manette held me at this moment in her innocent heart, do not think I have the presumption to assume so much, I could retain no place in it against her love for her father." "If that be so, do you see what, on the other hand, is involved in it?" "I understand equally well that a word from her father in any suitor's favour would outweigh herself and all the world. For which reason, Dr. Manette," said Darnay, modestly but firmly, "I would not ask that word to save my life." "I am sure of it." Charles Darnay. Mysteries arise out of close love as well as out of wide division. In the former case they are subtle and delicate, and difficult to penetrate. My daughter Lucie is, in this one respect, such a mystery to me. I can make no guess at the state of her heart. "May I ask, sir, if you think she is—" As he hesitated, her father supplied the rest. "Is sought by any other suitor?" "It is what I meant to say." Her father considered a little before he answered. "You have seen Mr. Carton here yourself. Mr. Stryver is here too, occasionally. If it be at all, it can only be by one of these." "Or both," said Darnay. "I had not thought of both. I should not think either likely. You want a promise from me. Tell me what it is." "It is that if Miss Manette should bring to you at any time on her own part such a confidence as I have ventured to lay before you, you will bear testimony to what I have said and to your belief in it. I hope you may be able to think so well of me as to urge no influence against me. I say nothing more of my stake in this. This is what I ask. The condition on which I ask it, and which you have an undoubted right to require, I will observe immediately." "I give the promise," said the doctor, "without any condition. I believe your object to be purely and truthfully as you have stated it. I believe your intention is to perpetuate and not to weaken the ties between me and my other and far dearer self. If she should ever tell me that you are essential to her perfect happiness, I will give her to you. If there were, Charles Darnay, if there were—" The young man had taken his hand gratefully. Their hands were joined as the doctor spoke. "Any fancies, any reasons, any apprehensions, anything whatsoever, new or old, against the man she really loved, the direct responsibility thereof not lying on his head, they should all be obliterated for her sake. She is everything to me. More to me than suffering, more to me than wrong, more to me, well, this is idle talk." So strange was the way in which he faded into silence, and so strange his fixed look when he had ceased to speak, that Darnay felt his own hand turn cold in the hand that slowly released and dropped it. "You said something to me," said Dr. Manette, breaking into a smile. "What was it you said to me?" He was at a loss how to answer until he remembered having spoken of a condition. Relieved as his mind reverted to that, he answered, "Your confidence in me ought to be returned with full confidence on my part. My present name, though but slightly changed from my mother's, is not, as you will remember, my own. I wish to tell you what that is, and why I am in England." "Stop," said the doctor of Beauvais. "I wish it, that I may the better deserve your confidence, and have no secret from you." "Stop!" For an instant the doctor even had his two hands at his ears, for another instant even had his two hands laid on Darnay's lips. "Tell me when I ask you, not now. If your suit should prosper, if Lucie should love you, you shall tell me on your marriage morning. Do you promise?" "Willingly." "Give me your hand. She will be home directly, and it is better she should not see us together tonight. Go. God bless you." It was dark when Charles Darnay left him, and it was an hour later and darker when Lucie came home. She hurried into the room alone, for Miss Pross had gone straight upstairs, and was surprised to find his reading chair empty. "My father!" she called to him. "Father, dear!" Nothing was said in answer, but she heard a low hammering sound in his bedroom. Passing lightly across the intermediate room, she looked in at his door and came running back frightened, crying to herself with her blood all chilled, "What shall I do? What shall I do?" Her uncertainty lasted but a moment. She hurried back and tapped at his door and softly called to him. The noise ceased at the sound of her voice, and he presently came out to her, and they walked up and down together for a long time. She came down from her bed to look at him in his sleep that night. He slept heavily, and his tray of shoemaking tools and his old unfinished work were all as usual. End of Book 2, Chapter 10.